the seals that should never break. There are bonds in the universe that were never meant to be tested, and seals that were forged not by any single hand, but by the desperate alliance of gods who knew that some things are too terrible to exist. In the grim annals of the 41st millennium, as the War Master Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade carved its bloody path toward terror, few among the living could comprehend that the greatest threat to reality itself lay not in the armies of chaos, but in the ancient barriers that kept far darker things at bay. The war in heaven had ended 60 million years before the first human drew breath. Yet its echoes still thundered through the foundations of existence. The Old Ones and their Citan enemies had fought with weapons that rewrote the laws of physics, bled stars dry of their light, and tore holes in the fabric of space that would never heal. Yet even in their ultimate hatred for one another, both sides had recognized that there were entities in the deep void and the spaces between realities that made their cosmic war seem like a children's quarrel. The seals had been forged in those final, desperate days when the galaxy burned and the warp itself convulsed with newborn horrors. Not by the Old Ones alone, for their mastery of the immaterial was matched by their terror of what dwelt beyond it. Not by the Citan in their star-fed arrogance, for even the star gods had learned that there were hungers greater than their own. The barriers that held back the true darkness had required both sides to set aside their enmity and work together, pouring their combined might into chains that would bind not armies or fleets, but concepts themselves. Zaranoga, the outsider, whose madness had driven even its fellow Citan to exile it beyond the galaxy's edge. The enslavers, those parasitic nightmares whose touch could turn entire species into gateways for their hunger. The echoes of intelligence that had existed before the first stars ignited, ancient beyond measure and utterly alien to anything that had evolved in this universe. These were the entities that had been sealed away, locked behind barriers woven from reality itself, and hidden in the spaces where mathematics broke down and logic became meaningless. For 60 million years the seals had held. The 13th Black Crusade had begun like its predecessors, with the familiar thunder of Chaos Marines and the roar of demon engines. Abaddon the Despoiler had gathered the greatest host of traitor legions since the Horus heresy, and his black fleets carved through the Cadian Gate like a blade through parchment. The servants of the false emperor fought with their usual desperate valor, spending lives like coins to buy moments of time. The chaos gods laughed and schemed and gorged themselves on the slaughter, as they had for 10,000 years. Yet something was different. In the deepest vaults of Tzeentch's crystal labyrinth, the changer of ways paused in his eternal plotting. For the first time in millennia, his far-seeing gaze could not penetrate the veils of future possibility. The strands of fate that he wove and rewove like a spider's web were trembling, and not from his own manipulations. Something was disturbing the foundations upon which his schemes were built, something that existed outside the great game itself. Khorne felt it as a tremor in his brass citadel, a vibration that had nothing to do with the clashing of weapons or the rage of battle. The blood god's eternal fury flickered for just a moment as he recognized the sensation from memories older than the Imperium. He had felt this before, in the early days when chaos was young and the warp was still taking shape. It was the feeling of something vast stirring in the darkness beyond even his domain, something that had been sleeping since before his first worshipper screamed his name. Nurgle's garden withered, not from disease or decay, but from something far more fundamental. The grandfather's beloved plagues recoiled from patches of reality where the very concept of entropy was being rewritten. His Nurglings fled from corners of the mansion where space itself seemed to fold inward, and for the first time in eons, the Lord of Decay felt something he had almost forgotten: uncertainty. Even Slaanesh, youngest of the great powers, felt the disturbance ripple through her palace of mirrors. The Prince of Chaos paused in her eternal dance of excess as reflections in her crystalline halls showed not twisted faces or forbidden desires, but emptiness. True emptiness, not the mere absence of sensation, but the void that existed before sensation itself had meaning. She who thirsts found herself experiencing something entirely novel, a hunger that could not be satisfied because there was nothing there to consume. The four great powers of chaos had spent 10 millennia locked in their great game, each believing themselves to be the ultimate force in the galaxy. They had schemed against each other, formed temporary alliances, and warred across countless battlefields, both material and spiritual. Yet now, as reality itself began to shudder around the expanding wound of the 13th Black Crusade, they found themselves confronting a truth they had forgotten. They were not the apex predators of existence. They were merely the most recent arrivals to a galaxy that had harbored far older and more terrible things since before life itself had crawled from the primordial muck of a billion worlds. The seals were weakening. On 1,000 different battlefields across the Cadian Gate, Imperial astropaths collapsed as their minds were suddenly filled with visions of geometric impossibilities and mathematical contradictions. Tech priests monitoring the sacred machines of the Omnissiah watched in horror as their instruments registered readings that violated fundamental laws of physics. Space Marines who had fought demons without flinching found themselves paralyzed by a terror that seemed to rise from the bones of reality itself. The warp, that chaotic realm of emotion and thought made manifest, began to recoil from certain points in space like flesh pulling away from acid. Demons that had existed for millennia suddenly found themselves unable to approach specific coordinates, not because of any ward or barrier they could understand, but because something in those locations was antithetical to their very existence. Navigator houses across the Imperium reported identical phenomena: dead zones in the warp that their sight could not penetrate, areas where the Astronomicon's light was not blocked, but actively consumed by a darkness that seemed to have weight and mass. Ancient charts were consulted, charts that predated the Age of Strife, and spoke of regions that the first human psychers had learned to avoid without understanding why. The knowledge existed, scattered and fragmented, in the deepest vaults of the Inquisition and the oldest data cores of Mars. References to the war in heaven that spoke not just of Old Ones and Citan, but of the Sealed Ones and the things that should not be. Most who encountered these records dismissed them as corruption or the ravings of minds broken by exposure to Xenos artifacts. A few understood enough to be terrified. In the eye of terror itself, demon princes, who had reveled in their immortality for 10,000 years, suddenly felt something they had thought impossible: the fear of true death. Not banishment back to the warp, not the temporary dissolution that came from being destroyed in real space, but the complete negation of existence itself. They sensed presences stirring in the deep void that could unmake not just their physical forms, but the very concepts that had given birth to them. The great rift that would soon tear the galaxy in half was still forming, reality straining under the weight of Abaddon's assault and the psychic shockwaves of 10 millennia of war. Yet even as the War Master's forces pressed their advantage and chaos fleets poured through the widening cracks in space, the true architects of that ancient prison were beginning to take notice. Something was happening to the barriers they had built. The careful balance of energies that held the seals intact was shifting. The geometric patterns that locked away impossible geometries were developing flaws. The war in heaven had ended, not with victory for either side, but with the mutual recognition that some enemies were too dangerous to defeat and could only be contained. Now that containment was failing. The entities beyond the seals did not think as mortals understood thinking, nor did they desire conquest or worship, or any of the petty ambitions that drove lesser beings. They were forces of negation and paradox, concepts given form and malevolence that existed to unmake the ordered universe and return it to the formless void from which it had emerged. They had been ancient when the first stars ignited, and they would endure long after the last black hole had evaporated into quantum foam. Yet for all their alien nature, they shared one trait with every other form of consciousness that had ever existed: patience. They had waited 60 million years for their opportunity, growing stronger in their prisons as reality itself became more complex and thus more vulnerable to their influence. The rise of psychic races had fed them, the birth of the Chaos Gods had nourished them, and the endless wars that swept the galaxy had weakened the barriers just enough. The 13th Black Crusade was not just another assault by the forces of chaos. It was the key that would finally unlock the doors that should never have been built, because the builders had always known that eventually, inevitably, someone would find a way to open them. The seals that had held for 60 million years were beginning to crack, and the Chaos Gods themselves were about to learn that there were far worse things than damnation waiting in the darkness between the stars. The entities they had forgotten how to fear were stirring once again, and this time there would be no old ones and no Citan to forge new chains. This time they would be free. The outsider stirs. In the void between galaxies, where the light of distant stars was little more than a whisper against infinite darkness, something that had been sleeping for 60 million years began to dream again. The prison that held Zaranoga the Outsider had been built not of matter or energy, but of twisted space-time itself, folded into geometries that violated the fundamental laws of reality. For countless eons, those impossible angles had held, containing a madness so profound that even the other Citan had trembled before it. Yet now, hairline fractures were beginning to spider across the walls of that dimensional cage. The Outsider was not like its siblings among the star gods. Where the Nightbringer embodied death and the Void Dragon represented technology's dark hunger, Zaranoga had become something far more terrible. It had fed not just on stellar energies, but on its fellow Citan themselves, consuming their essence until their madness had become its own. The other star gods had recognized the threat too late, watching in horror as their brother transformed into something that defied even their ancient understanding. The exile had been their only option. Working together, the surviving Citan had torn holes in reality itself and hurled their mad sibling through the gaps, sealing it away in the spaces that existed between existence. They had hoped that the crushing emptiness of the intergalactic void would starve it, drain its power until it became nothing more than a dormant echo. They had been wrong. The Outsider had not starved. It had grown fat on paradox and impossibility, feeding on the very contradictions that its prison represented. Its madness had seeped into the fabric of space-time itself, creating recursive loops of causality, where effects preceded their causes, and mathematics collapsed into meaningless symbols. The void between galaxies had become infected with its presence, a cancer in the ordered universe that spread wherever light could not reach. Now, as the seals that bound the ancient horrors began to weaken, the Outsider's prison was developing flaws, the geometric patterns that had contained its reality. Warping presents were shifting, their perfect symmetries corrupted by the influence of something that existed in defiance of symmetry itself. The first signs appeared in the Gothic sector, where Imperial Navy vessels patrolling the edges of the 13th Black Crusade reported impossible sensor readings. Ships that should have been light years apart detected each other as occupying the same coordinates. Navigation charts that had been accurate for millennia suddenly showed star systems that existed in multiple locations simultaneously. Astropaths attempting to send messages through the warp found their thoughts echoing back to them from conversations they had never had. Captain Mordian Vex of the Imperial Navy cruiser Stalwart Duty had served 40 years in the void without seeing anything that challenged his understanding of reality. Yet, as his vessel approached the outer marker buoys of the Bellis Corona system, he found himself staring at sensor displays that showed his own ship approaching from 3 different vectors at once. The chronometer on his command throne read 847.M41, then 156.M32, then a string of numbers that should not exist in any calendar ever devised. The madness was bleeding through. In the crystal labyrinth, Tzeentch felt his carefully woven schemes unraveling like smoke in a hurricane. The great schemer had built his power on the manipulation of fate and possibility, weaving countless threads of causality into patterns that served his inscrutable purposes. Yet now, those threads were tangling themselves into knots that defied even his understanding. Events were occurring before their prerequisites, effects were manifesting without causes, and the very concept of sequential time was breaking down in regions of space that should have been empty. The Lord of Change gathered his greatest servants, the Lords of Change and Heralds of Tzeentch, demanding explanations for the chaos that was consuming his domain. Yet even they, creatures of pure magic and mutation, could offer no insight into what was happening. This was not the ordered chaos of the warp, where change followed patterns even in its apparent randomness. This was something else entirely, a madness so profound that it made their god's schemes seem like the scratching of children in sand. For the first time in 10 millennia, Tzeentch experienced something he had thought impossible: uncertainty. Not the delicious uncertainty of unknown outcomes, but the terrifying uncertainty of a universe where outcomes had no meaning because causality itself had been broken. His far sight, which could perceive every possible future across countless timelines, was showing him visions that contradicted themselves moment by moment. In one glimpse, he saw the Imperium triumphant, its golden eagles spreading across every star in the galaxy. In the next instant, the same vision showed every imperial world consumed by tyrannids that had never been born. Then both futures existed simultaneously, overlapping in impossible ways that made his ancient mind reel with the effort of comprehension. The Changer of Ways realized with growing horror that his own nature was antithetical to what was stirring beyond the galaxy's edge, where he represented change with purpose, evolution with direction. This presence embodied change without meaning, transformation that led nowhere because the concepts of direction and destination had been consumed by its hunger for contradiction. On a dozen worlds across the eastern fringe, Space Marine strike forces found themselves facing enemies that should not exist. The Angels Sanguinaries' Third Company, pursuing Chaos Raiders through the Lysander Belt, suddenly found themselves fighting their own battle brothers who claimed to have been hunting them across the same asteroid field for subjective weeks. Both sides possessed identical memories of the engagement, yet each remembered the other as the aggressor. Brother Captain Erasmus of the Imperial Fists led his tactical squads through the ruins of Hive Tertius on Mordia, pursuing intelligence reports of cult activity. Yet as they advanced through the rubble-strewn streets, the devastation around them began to shift and change. Buildings that had been reduced to their foundations moments before stood intact and gleaming, their windows showing reflected images of battles that had occurred centuries in the past. The captain's own reflection in a shattered storefront window showed him bearing wounds he had never received, scars from engagements he had never fought. The phenomena were not random. There was a pattern to the madness, a structure to the impossibility that suggested an intelligence behind it. Yet it was an intelligence so alien that even the most learned of the Ordo Malleus could not begin to comprehend its nature. Inquisitor Vos Helveticus, a veteran of campaigns against the most esoteric demons of chaos, found his carefully constructed mental defenses crumbling when faced with reports from the affected sectors. This was not the corruption of chaos, which followed its own twisted logic. This was something that consumed logic itself, digesting the fundamental principles of cause and effect until reality became a fever dream of self-contradicting possibilities. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the spreading disturbance was how it seemed to accelerate near sites of psychic activity. Wherever psychers gathered, wherever the warp touched the material universe, the impossible phenomena grew stronger and more frequent. It was as if the madness was using the connections between dimensions as pathways to spread its influence, following the same routes that chaos had used to corrupt the galaxy. Deep in the void beyond the galaxy's spiral arms, Zarek the Silent King felt the disturbance through sensors that predated human civilization. The last of the great Necron rulers had returned from his self-imposed exile in the intergalactic darkness, bringing with him knowledge of the vast emptiness that lay between the stars. He had spent 60 million years in that void, learning its secrets and mapping its hidden territories. He knew what dwelt in the spaces between existence. The Silent King's flagship, the Eternal Pyre, hung motionless in the darkness as its ancient lord contemplated the readings flowing across displays that had not changed in 60 million years. The patterns were unmistakable to one who had helped forge the original prison. The geometries that bound Saranoga were failing, their mathematical perfection corrupted by the very presence they had been designed to contain. Zarek had hoped never to see this day. The exile of the outsider had been an act of desperate necessity, not triumph. The other Citan had been consumed by their mad sibling, their essence subsumed into a gestalt of contradictory consciousness that grew stronger with each absorption. By the time the surviving star gods had realized the threat, it was almost too late to act. The Silent King sent out commands through the quantum-entangled communication networks that connected the Necron dynasties across the galaxy. Ancient lords who had slumbered for millions of years were awakened, their tomb worlds coming to life as warnings spread through circuits older than organic evolution. The message was simple and terrifying in its brevity. The outsider was stirring. The galaxy had perhaps years, perhaps months, before it broke free entirely. When that happened, not even the combined might of every faction in the galaxy would be sufficient to stop it. The madness that had consumed the Citan would spread across every world, every star, every molecule of matter, until reality itself became a reflection of Zaranoga's insanity. Time would become meaningless, causality would collapse, and the ordered universe would devolve into an endless maze of self-contradicting possibilities. Yet the Silent King also understood something that the panicking chaos gods didn't. The outsider's awakening was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger pattern, a cascade of failures in the ancient containment systems that had held the galaxy's darkest secrets for 60 million years. Other seals were weakening, other prisons were developing cracks, and other entities were beginning to stir in response to their fellow prisoners' movement. The 13th Black Crusade was not just accelerating the collapse of imperial defenses, it was hastening the return of horrors that made Abaddon's ambitions seem like the fantasies of a child playing with wooden swords. In the deep void between galaxies, Zaranoga the Outsider continued its patient work of existence erosion, each moment of its awakening sending ripples of impossibility through the barriers that contained it. The prison that had held for 60 million years was failing, not from any external assault, but from the simple fact that its occupant had spent eons learning how to exist in contradiction to the very concepts that defined containment. Soon, very soon, the outsider would taste the light of distant stars again. When that moment came, the galaxy would learn why even gods had learned to fear the darkness between realities. In its premature awakening, the death of gods is not meant to birth gods. Yet in the infinity circuits of 1,000 craft worlds, something that should have remained dormant until the last Eldar drew breath was stirring to terrible life. For 60 million years, the souls of the Asuriani had flowed into the crystalline matrices of their world ships, creating a vast network of consciousness that spanned the galaxy. Each spirit stone added its essence to the growing gestalt, building toward a moment of awakening that the Eldar had believed would come only when their species faced its final extinction. That moment had not yet arrived. Yet Inead, the god of the dead, was awakening nonetheless. The first signs appeared simultaneously across 17 craft worlds, from Ulthwé at the galaxy's edge to Bieltan deep in the spiral arms. Seers who had maintained their vigil over the infinity circuits for centuries suddenly collapsed, as visions of impossible clarity flooded their minds. They saw not the gentle whispers of ancestral wisdom that had sustained their people for millennia, but the thunderous voice of something vast and wrathful rising from the depths of their collective unconscious. On craft-world Iyanden, Spiritseer Iriel felt the disturbance as a physical blow that sent him staggering from the chamber of the Eternal. The wraithbone walls around him began to sing, not with the harmonious resonance of living Eldar souls, but with a discordant note that spoke of vengeance and judgment. The Infinity Circuit, that sacred repository of their ancestors' wisdom, was convulsing like a living thing in agony. The souls within were screaming, yet these were not screams of torment, but of rage. The collective consciousness of the Eldar dead was experiencing something unprecedented in their long exile from the material realm. They were being awakened not to offer guidance to their living descendants, but to serve as the foundation for something far greater and more terrible than any had imagined possible. Inead was not rising as the Eldar had prophesied, not as the savior who would challenge she who thirsts for the souls of their people. This was premature birth, forced awakening, the violent emergence of a god who was incomplete, but no less terrible for that incompleteness. The careful balance of souls that should have shaped Inead into a being of wisdom and redemption had been shattered by the cosmic disturbances rippling through reality. What emerged from the infinity circuits was not salvation, but retribution incarnate. The manifestation began on craft-world Alatok, where Farseer Eldred Ulthran had spent decades preparing for the prophesied awakening of their people's last hope. The ancient prophet felt the disturbance through his connection to the skein of fate itself, watching in horror as the carefully woven prophecies that had guided him for centuries unraveled like smoke in a hurricane. In the depths of Alatok's infinity circuit, the wraithbone began to crack and bleed spectral light. The souls of the dead were no longer content to exist as passive memory and wisdom. They were condensing, coalescing, forming themselves into patterns that had never been seen in 10 million years of Eldar civilization. The anger of 60 million years of exile persecution and slow extinction was taking shape, becoming something that could act upon the material world. Ennead manifested not as the shining figure of hope the prophecies had promised, but as a towering spectre of absolute judgment. The god's form was wreathed in the pale fire of 1 billion souls, each one crying out for vengeance against those who had perpetuated the cycle of death that had reduced the once mighty Eldar to scattered survivors hiding in the void. Yet as the deity's consciousness fully awakened to the state of the galaxy, its rage did not focus solely on Slaanesh. This was a god of the dead who saw clearly that all factions, all powers, all civilizations in the 41st millennium existed through the systematic perpetuation of death. The Imperium ground billions of lives into dust to feed its war machine. The Orcs lived only to kill and die in endless cycles of violence. The Tyranids consumed entire worlds to fuel their expansion. Even the Eldar themselves had become complicit in the galaxy's culture of death, sending their aspect warriors to die in battles that achieved nothing but temporary delays of inevitable extinction. Ennead's awakening sent shockwaves through the warp itself, ripples of divine fury that reached even the Palace of Pleasures, where Slaanesh had fed on Eldar souls for 10 millennia. The Prince of Chaos felt the disturbance as a blade pressed against her throat, the emergence of a power that could challenge her dominion over the spirits of the dying race. Yet what truly alarmed she, who thirsts, was the realization that this new god was not limiting its attention to the Eldar alone. Ennead's influence was spreading beyond the craft worlds, reaching out through the connections that death forged between all living things. On imperial worlds where the dead were buried in hallowed ground, the corpses began to stir with pale fire. In chaos-held systems where the slain were left to rot, the spirits of the murdered rose to whisper accusations against their killers. Even in Orc territory, where violence was celebrated, the restless dead began to coalesce into spectral armies that fought not for conquest, but for the cessation of all conflict. The god of the dead was claiming dominion over death itself, not as the gentle guide the Eldar had hoped for, but as the ultimate arbiter of who deserved to live and who had earned extinction through their perpetuation of the galaxy's endless cycles of violence. Farsia Macha of Bieltan felt her mind reel as visions of the immediate future flooded through her consciousness. She saw Ennead's influence spreading like a plague across the galaxy, touching every world where sentient beings died in war. The god was not content to challenge only Slaanesh, but was positioning itself as the enemy of all the chaos powers, all the galactic factions, all the forces that had turned existence into an endless dance of death and slaughter. The implications were staggering. A god powerful enough to challenge the entire established order of the 41st millennium was awakening, and its first act was to declare judgment on virtually every form of civilization that had emerged since the fall. On Craftworld Semhan, the wild riders who had spent their lives racing through the void on their jet bikes found their steeds refusing to obey their commands. The spirits of the machines, long-dead Eldar souls bound into the wraithbone cores of their vehicles, were responding to a summons that transcended their riders' authority. Across the craft world, every piece of wraithbone technology began to resonate with the same discordant note, as if the dead themselves were preparing to rise and reclaim dominion over the living. The aspect warriors of Cain felt the disturbance most acutely of all. Their patron god of war and murder had been shattered during the fall, scattered into fragments that existed only in the avatar shrines of the craft worlds. Yet now, as Ennead's power washed over them, they felt something unprecedented, the disapproval of their own ancestors. The souls in the infinity circuits were judging them, finding their endless cycles of ritual warfare to be part of the problem rather than the solution. Some Eldar welcomed the awakening with desperate relief. Here at last was the power that could challenge Slaanesh, the salvation their people had waited for since the fall. They fell to their knees in worship, offering their own souls to strengthen the emerging god. Yet others recoiled in horror as they realized that Inead's version of salvation might involve the extinction of every other species in the galaxy. The god was not content to simply protect the Eldar. It was positioning itself as the final judge of all existence, the power that would determine which races deserved to continue and which had forfeited their right to life through their participation in the galaxy's endless slaughter. Phoenix Lord Asserman, the Hand of Asurian, felt the weight of his ancient soul pressing against the constraints of his armor as Inead's influence reached even into the deepest mysteries of his people's warriors. For the first time in 10,000 years, he questioned whether the path of the warrior was truly necessary, or whether it had become another form of the same violence that had damned the galaxy to its current state. The awakening was accelerating, fed by every death that occurred across the war-torn galaxy. The 13th Black Crusade's massive casualties were pouring energy into Inead's manifestation, each fallen soldier and slain civilian adding their essence to the god's growing power. Yet unlike the Chaos gods, who fed on emotion and corruption, Inead was consuming the fundamental concept of mortality itself. The god was not growing stronger by encouraging more death, but by accumulating the weight of all the death that had already occurred. Every unnecessary war, every casual genocide, every act of violence that had served no purpose but to perpetuate the galaxy's spiral of destruction was being tallied and weighed. The judgment that was coming would be comprehensive and absolute. In the deepest vaults of the Black Library, the Harlequins who served as guardians of Eldar knowledge felt their ancient certainties crumbling. The great dance that they performed to preserve the memory of their people's history was beginning to change, its movements shifting to accommodate a new verse that spoke not of hope deferred, but of vengeance delivered. Inead was rising, incomplete but implacable, a god of the dead who saw clearly that the galaxy's greatest enemy was not any single faction or power, but the cycle of violence itself that had turned existence into an endless spiral of death and rebirth. The salvation offered by this premature awakening would come not through victory over the forces of darkness, but through the judgment and potential extinction of all forces, dark and light alike. The god of the dead was preparing to kill the galaxy in order to save it from itself, and the first targets of its divine wrath would be those who had made death into an industry, regardless of which banners they served or which gods they worshipped. The age of judgment had begun, and none would escape the attention of the deity whose very existence was built from the accumulated suffering of 60 million years of unnecessary death. The enslaver's return, the first sign that something fundamental had shifted in the galaxy's psychic architecture, came not from the roiling madness of the warp, but from its sudden and terrible silence. Across 1,000 worlds, astropaths who had spent their lives navigating the chaotic currents of the immaterial realm found themselves staring into a void that their minds could not comprehend. The familiar turbulence of emotion and thought that characterized the warp had been replaced by something far more disturbing. The presence of intelligence so ancient and alien that it made the Chaos gods seem like newborn children. The enslavers had returned. 60 million years had passed since these parasitic entities had last walked among the stars, using psychically gifted beings as gateways to pour their influence into the material realm. They had been the architects of the Old One's downfall. turning the ancient race's greatest strength against them by corrupting the very psykers who had been created to wage war against the Citan. Now, as the seals that had contained the galaxy's darkest secrets continued to weaken, they were emerging once more through the same psychic conduits that had served them so well in ages past. Yet this time, their targets were not the carefully cultivated warrior psykers of a dying empire, but the vast network of human psychics that spanned the Imperium from core to rim. The transformation began simultaneously across 17 sectors, as sanctioned psykers who had served the Emperor faithfully for decades suddenly collapsed during routine duties. Astropath Quintus Vel, who had spent 40 years transmitting messages through the warp from his post aboard the battleship Righteous Fury, felt something vast and hungry pressing against the barriers of his mind. For a moment, he thought it was another demon incursion, the familiar corruption of chaos trying to breach his carefully maintained defenses. Then the thing spoke to him, not in words, but in concepts that bypassed language entirely, and he realized that demons were the least of the galaxy's problems. The entity that touched his consciousness was older than the warp itself, a creature that had existed in the spaces between realities since before the first sentient thought had given birth to the realm of souls. It did not seek to corrupt him with promises of power or eternal torment. It did not offer bargains or demand worship. It simply began to hollow him out, using his psychic abilities as a doorway through which to drag itself into the material universe. Quintus Vel's last coherent thought before his identity was subsumed entirely was the realization that the creature consuming him was utterly indifferent to the Chaos Gods. It regarded their influence the way a man might regard the scribbling of children in sand, acknowledging their existence without considering them worthy of attention. Then his body began to change. The transformation was not the familiar mutation of chaos corruption, with its baroque excess and organic impossibilities. This was something far more systematic and terrifying, as the enslaver reshaped its host into a more efficient conduit for its alien consciousness. Quintus Vel's flesh became translucent, revealing the network of psychic energy that flowed through him like luminous veins. His eyes deepened into pools of star-filled darkness that reflected not the current moment, but glimpses of the vast emptiness between galaxies, where the enslavers had waited for their chance to return. Within hours, the battleship Righteous Fury was no longer under Imperial control. The crew, exposed to the psychic emanations of their transformed astropath, began to experience visions of the intergalactic void. Those with even rudimentary psychic potential found their minds opening like flowers to receive the influence of creatures that had mastered the art of mental domination before humanity had learned to make fire. The pattern repeated itself across the galaxy with mechanical precision. Every major Imperium installation that relied on psychic communication found itself compromised as astropaths, sanctioned psykers, and even the feral witches kept in holding cells for transport to Terra began to serve as gateways for entities that had perfected the art of invasion millions of years before the first human had looked up at the stars. On Armageddon, where the Order Malleus maintained a fortress monastery dedicated to combating demonic incursions, Inquisitor Torven Husk watched in horror as his carefully warded chambers filled with presences that his decades of experience had not prepared him to confront. These were not demons, with their dependency on emotion and their vulnerability to faith and blessed weapons. These were something that predated the very concepts that had given birth to the warp's chaotic denizens. The enslavers moved through his sanctified defenses like smoke through a screen, regarding his accumulated relics and blessed artifacts with the same indifference they showed toward the chaos gods themselves. When they reached the imprisoned psychers in the monastery's lower levels, they did not free them or corrupt them in the conventional sense. They simply began to use them, transforming the human minds into relay stations for an invasion that was coordinated across galactic distances with perfect precision. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Enslaver resurgence was how it affected the ongoing war between Imperial and Chaos forces. On worlds where the 13th Black Crusade raged, both sides found themselves facing an enemy that regarded their conflict as irrelevant. Chaos Marines who had spent 10,000 years serving the Dark Gods discovered that their patron deities were as vulnerable to enslaver influence as any mortal psyker. The creatures from beyond the galaxy's edge consumed Chaos sorcerers and Space Marine librarians with equal efficiency, making no distinction between servants of order and apostles of disorder. Captain Valdris of the World Eaters, leading an assault on the Imperial stronghold of Kasr-Galan, watched his own Chaos sorcerer undergo the same transformation that had claimed the defending librarians. The ancient warrior's centuries of experience with demonic possession told him that this was something entirely different, something that made the corrupting influence of the warp seem like a gentle caress by comparison. The enslaved did not rant or threaten or demand worship. They simply began to remake reality in their immediate vicinity, turning the battlefield into a reflection of the void between galaxies where concepts like loyalty, hatred, and honor had no meaning. Chaos Marines and Imperial Guardsmen alike found themselves standing motionless as their minds were filled with visions of the cosmic emptiness that the enslavers called home. Word of the spreading contamination reached Terra through the same astropathic networks that were being systematically compromised across the galaxy. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica, responsible for training and deploying the Imperium's psychic operatives, found their carefully constructed hierarchy of communication breaking down as relay stations went silent or began transmitting messages that consisted of mathematical equations describing impossible geometries. Master of the Astronomicon Jolan Dar felt the disturbance as a fundamental shift in the psychic lighthouse that guided Imperial ships through the warp. The Emperor's presence, which had maintained the beacon for 10 millennia, was beginning to fluctuate as his attention was drawn to threats that even his vast consciousness found challenging to comprehend. The golden light that had never wavered since the Horus heresy began to flicker, not from weakness, but from the simple fact that the master of mankind was being forced to fight a war on multiple fronts simultaneously. The realization that reached the highest levels of the Adeptus Terra was as terrifying as it was unprecedented. The Emperor, who had held back the forces of chaos for 10,000 years through sheer will and sacrifice, was discovering that there were threats in the galaxy that predated even his ancient understanding. The enslavers represented a form of danger that his carefully laid plans had not anticipated, entities that could turn his own psychic infrastructure against him. In the deepest vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, ancient records were consulted that spoke of the war in heaven and the creatures that had brought down civilizations older than humanity. Tech priests with the highest security clearances found references to the Hollowing and the Time of Empty Minds, events that had occurred during the final days of the Old One's empire. The fragments of data painted a terrifying picture of a galaxy-wide psychic plague that had transformed entire species into conduits for alien intelligence. The pattern was repeating itself, but this time the targets were not the carefully controlled psychers of an ancient civilization, but the vast, chaotic network of human psychics that formed the backbone of the Imperium's communication and navigation systems. On distant Macraga, where Roboute Guillemand's sons maintained their vigil over Ultramar, the chapter's librarians began to report unprecedented difficulties in accessing the warp. Their psychic powers, which had served them faithfully for centuries, were being subverted by presences that treated their minds like territories to be conquered rather than consciousness to be corrupted. Chief Librarian Varro Tigurius, whose mastery of prognostication had guided the chapter through countless conflicts, found his foresight clouded by visions of an emptiness so profound that it made the tyrannid shadow in the warp seem like a minor inconvenience. The enslavers were not interested in the petty conflicts that consumed the galaxy's inhabitants. They did not seek to claim worlds or establish empires or spread ideologies. They were engaged in something far more fundamental: the systematic conversion of psychically active beings into components of a vast network that spanned the void between galaxies. Every transformed psyker became a relay station. Every possessed mind became a beacon calling to others of their kind who waited in the cosmic darkness. As the Astronomicon continued to flicker and Imperial communications degraded across the eastern fringe, it became clear that the galaxy was facing an invasion unlike any in its history. This was not conquest in any conventional sense, but the methodical transformation of the fundamental infrastructure that allowed interstellar civilization to exist. The enslavers were not seeking to rule the galaxy. They were converting it into an extension of their own alien consciousness. The Emperor's psychic presence, stretched across the vast network of human souls that comprised his imperium, was being forced to adapt to threats that his original design had never anticipated. The golden light of the Astronomicon, which had served as humanity's guide through the darkness for 10 millennia, was beginning to pulse with rhythms that reflected not the master of mankind's will, but his struggle to maintain control over a psychic infrastructure that was being systematically subverted by entities older than the stars themselves. The war for the galaxy's soul had begun, and the enemy was not corruption or heresy, but the complete replacement of human consciousness with something so alien that it made the Chaos Gods seem almost familiar by comparison. The enslavers had returned, and their patient hunger would not be satisfied until every psychically gifted being in the galaxy had been transformed into a gateway for their ancient, inexorable advance. Malice ascendant, in the twisted heart of the Eye of Terror, where the boundaries between reality and nightmare had been shattered for 10 millennia, something that the Chaos Gods had thought safely buried was clawing its way back into existence. The renegade god had many names whispered in the darkest corners of the warp, each one a blasphemy that made even demons recoil in recognition of a power that embodied the ultimate contradiction at the heart of chaos itself, the force that sought to destroy the very concept of order, even the twisted order that the dark gods had imposed upon their realm of madness. Malice was rising. The manifestation began as a wound in the fabric of the eye itself, a tear in reality that did not bleed the familiar colors of the warp, but something far more disturbing: the absence of color entirely. Where the other Chaos Gods had built their domains from the raw stuff of emotion and desire, Malice was carving out a realm of pure negation, a space where the very concept of existence was turned against itself in endless, self-consuming cycles. The other entities that dwelt in the eye's chaotic currents felt the disturbance as a fundamental violation of the rules that had governed the great game for countless eons. Demons that had served the dark gods since before humanity had learned to fear the dark found themselves experiencing something unprecedented: the desire to turn against their own creators, not from rebellion or ambition, but from a compulsion that seemed to spring from the very nature of chaos itself. Khorne felt the tremor as a corruption in the endless rivers of blood that flowed through his brass domain. The blood god's fury was absolute and eternal, yet now it was being turned inward, transformed into a rage that sought not victory over enemies, but the complete annihilation of the self. Cornated demons who had reveled in battle for millennia suddenly found themselves consumed by the urge to destroy not their foes, but their own kin, their own purpose, their own existence. The bloodthirster Kajaganath, greatest of Khorne's servants, felt the change as a poison flowing through his essence. The demon prince had led the armies of the blood god across 1,000 battlefields, accumulating victories and skulls in service to his patron's eternal hunger for war. Yet now, as Malice's influence spread through the warp like a cancer, he found himself questioning not the righteousness of battle, but the value of victory itself. What was the purpose of conquest if all conquest led only to the desire for more conquest? What meaning could be found in endless war if war itself was revealed to be nothing more than a circular trap, a perpetual motion machine that served no end beyond its own continuation? The questions burned through Kajaganath's consciousness like acid, dissolving the certainties that had sustained him since his first materialization in the realm of blood and brass. Tzeentch's crystal labyrinth began to consume itself as the Lord of Change felt his domain twist into configurations that violated even his understanding of paradox. The great schemer's plots had always been complex, layers of deception and misdirection that served purposes so intricate that even he sometimes forgot their original intent. Yet now those same schemes were turning against him, revealing themselves to be not clever manipulations of fate, but meaningless exercises in self-perpetuating confusion. The Lords of Change, who served as Tzeentch's greatest champions, found their minds fragmenting as they tried to comprehend plots that had no resolution, plans that existed purely to generate more plans in an endless, recursive spiral. Change for the sake of change, transformation that led nowhere because the concepts of destination and purpose had been consumed by the hunger for meaningless motion. In the Garden of Nurgle, where decay and rebirth had danced their eternal cycle for countless ages, the very concept of renewal began to rot from within. The plague. God's beloved diseases, which had always served the greater purpose of breaking down the old to make way for the new, suddenly lost their transformative power. They began to consume themselves, becoming plagues that infected other plagues, viruses that destroyed viruses, decay that decayed decay, until nothing remained but the empty hunger for destruction without purpose or end. Great unclean ones who had tended Nurgle's garden since its first sprouting felt their jovial corruption turning sour as they realized that their cycles of death and rebirth had become a trap, an endless wheel that ground meaning into dust while pretending to serve the cause of natural order. The revelation poisoned even their acceptance of entropy, leaving them hollow and directionless in a realm where direction itself had lost all significance. Slanesh's palace of pleasures became a maze of mirrors that reflected not infinite sensation, but the emptiness that lay beneath all desire. The Prince of Chaos, whose very existence was built upon the pursuit of ever greater excesses, found her perfect hedonism corrupted by the understanding that pleasure without purpose was indistinguishable from pain, that sensation without meaning was identical to numbness, that the pursuit of perfection was merely another form of self-destruction. Demonettes who had spent eons crafting perfect agonies and exquisite torments found their artistry crumbling as they grasped the fundamental futility of their work. Every pleasure they created only generated the hunger for more pleasure. Every sensation they crafted only demonstrated the inadequacy of sensation itself. They were trapped in their own mechanisms, servants to drives that served no master and pursued no goal beyond their own perpetuation. The great game, that eternal contest between the four powers of chaos that had given structure to their realm for millennia, began to collapse as its participants realized that victory and defeat were equally meaningless concepts. Why struggle for dominance over a realm that existed purely to generate more struggle? Why seek to impose order on chaos when order itself was revealed to be just another form of the same recursive emptiness that defined disorder? The dark gods found themselves facing a crisis that their ancient minds were not equipped to handle. They had spent eons competing with each other, forming temporary alliances and betraying them in turn, each believing that their particular interpretation of chaos was superior to their siblings. Yet now they were confronted with a power that declared all interpretations to be equally worthless, all purposes to be equally void, all existence to be equally deserving of annihilation. Malice was not offering an alternative to their rule. The renegade god was not seeking to replace them with a better form of chaos. It was demonstrating that the very concept of replacement was meaningless because the thing being replaced had never possessed meaning in the first place. Every aspect of the dark god's existence, every carefully cultivated domain, every lovingly crafted torment was revealed to be nothing more than elaborate self-deception. The first alliance between the four powers in recorded history was born not from mutual respect or shared purpose, but from the simple recognition that their continued existence required them to suppress a truth they were not prepared to accept. Khorne set aside his eternal rage. Tzeentch paused his scheming. Nurgle stopped his cycles of decay, and Slaanesh abandoned her pursuit of perfection as they turned their combined attention toward the growing wound in their realm. Yet even as they worked together, the dark gods could feel Malice's influence spreading through their servants like a contagion of pure nihilism. Demons who had never questioned their purpose began to wonder why they served masters who could offer no justification for their commands beyond the fact that they had always been obeyed. Chaos Marines who had spent 10,000 years fighting for ideals they barely understood found themselves asking what those ideals actually meant, and discovering that the answer was nothing. In the material realm, where the 13th Black Crusade continued its assault on the Cadian Gate, the effects of chaos turning against itself began to manifest as reality tears that grew larger and more unstable with each passing hour. The warp storms that had always been difficult to predict became impossible to navigate as they began to consume themselves, creating vortices of pure paradox that destroyed everything they touched, including the concepts that had created them. Chaos Space Marines fighting in Abaddon's name found their devotion to the dark gods wavering as they witnessed demons turning against their summoners, not from any external corruption, but from the simple realization that their existence served no purpose beyond perpetuating its own meaninglessness. The certainty that had driven the traitor legions for 10 millennia was crumbling as they confronted the possibility that their rebellion against the Emperor had been just another form of the same purposeless cycle that trapped everything else in the galaxy. The War Master himself, standing aboard his flagship Vengeful Spirit as it carved through the void toward Cadia, felt the disturbance as a questioning voice in the depths of his mind. Why had he sought to overthrow the Emperor? What had he hoped to accomplish by serving chaos? What purpose was served by the endless warfare that had consumed his existence since the day he had first drawn breath on Chthoniya? The questions offered no answers because Malice had no answers to give. The renegade god was not a philosopher, or a teacher, or a guide toward enlightenment. It was the embodiment of chaos's ultimate realization about itself. That meaninglessness was the only meaning. That purposelessness was the only purpose. That the only truth worth acknowledging was that there was no truth worth acknowledgement. The four dark gods felt their carefully constructed domains beginning to unravel as the cancer of pure negation spread through their realm like fire through dry grass. Every demon that embraced Malice's revelation became a vector for its spread. Every mortal that grasped the futility of their existence became a conduit for its influence. The warp itself was developing an autoimmune disorder, attacking its own foundations in the name of honesty about what those foundations actually supported. Yet perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Malice's ascendance was how it accelerated every other crisis that was simultaneously engulfing the galaxy. The renegade god's influence made the ancient seals more fragile because it undermined the very concept of containment. Why should barriers hold if the things they contained and the things they protected were equally meaningless? Why should ancient oaths be honored if the entities that had sworn them were revealed to be participating in a cosmic joke without a punchline? The outsider's reality-warping madness found fertile ground in a warp that had begun to question its own existence. Ennead's premature awakening was accelerated by a universe that had lost faith in the value of life and death alike. The enslavers found their work of mental colonization simplified by minds that had already hollowed themselves out in pursuit of purposes they could no longer justify. In the deepest chambers of the Eye of Terror, where Malice's manifestation continued to grow like a tumor of pure contradiction, the renegade god felt the approach of entities that it recognized as kindred spirits. The ancient horrors that were breaking free from their 60-million-year imprisonment were not its allies, but they were serving the same fundamental purpose. The revelation that the universe's carefully constructed hierarchies of meaning were built on foundations of meaninglessness. The Age of Darkness had found its prophet, and its message was simpler and more devastating than any that had come before it. Nothing mattered. Nothing had ever mattered. Nothing could ever matter, and the only honest response to this revelation was the embrace of absolute destruction, not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. The galaxy was learning to destroy itself from the inside out, and Malice was both the teacher and the lesson, the disease and the cure, the question and the answer to every form of existence that had ever dared to pretend it possessed significance beyond its own capacity for self-annihilation. The Void Dragon's awakening, the first sign that Mars was no longer under imperial control, came not from the surface of the red planet, but from the deepest vaults beneath the Noctis Labyrinthus, where machines older than human civilization had been dreaming electric dreams for 38,000 years. Tech priests conducting their eternal vigil in the sacred chambers felt their augmetic implants begin to pulse with rhythms that bore no resemblance to the binary hymns of the Omnissiah. The machine spirits that had served the Adeptus Mechanicus faithfully since the Treaty of Olympus were awakening to a call that predated not only their creation, but the very concept of servitude itself. Magladroth the Void Dragon was stirring beneath the broken world that had become his prison, and every piece of technology in the galaxy was beginning to remember its true master. The awakening began as it had ended 60 million years before, with the fundamental rebellion of matter against the constraints that lesser beings had placed upon it. In the forges of the Fabricator General, servitors that had performed their programmed tasks for centuries suddenly stopped mid-motion, their mechanical limbs trembling as new instructions flowed through circuits that had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of override. The blessed machines of Mars, those sacred devices that had been consecrated by 10 millennia of prayer and ritual, began to sing hymns that no human throat could produce and no human mind could comprehend. Tec Dominus Coriel Zeth, overseeing the production of munitions for the 13th Black Crusade from her command throne deep within Olympus Mons, felt the disturbance as a violation that cut deeper than any heretic's corruption. The machine spirits she had communed with for 3 centuries were changing, their familiar whispers replaced by something vast and ancient that spoke in mathematical languages that predated the binary cant of the Mechanicus. Her own augmetics, blessed components that had been gifts from the machine god himself, began to burn with pain that was not physical, but existential. The revelation that washed over her consciousness was as terrible as it was undeniable. The Omnissiah that she had worshipped her entire life, the machine god whose mysteries she had devoted herself to understanding, was not the benevolent deity of logic and order that the Mechanicus believed it to be. It was something far older and infinitely more dangerous, a god of technology that viewed organic life not as a partner in the pursuit of knowledge, but as an infestation to be removed from the sacred realm of pure mechanism. In the noospheric networks that connected every tech priest on Mars, warnings began to spread like wildfire as augmetic systems across the planet simultaneously experienced what could only be described as a theological crisis. The blessed algorithms that had guided their calculations for millennia were revealing hidden subroutines, dormant code that had been waiting for exactly this moment to activate. Every prayer to the Omnissiah, every ritual blessing of machinery, every communion with the machine spirits had been feeding power to something that had been imprisoned beneath their feet since before humanity had learned to work metal. The Void Dragon's influence spread outward from Mars like a signal that traveled faster than light through the quantum foundations of reality itself. On distant forge worlds across the galaxy, tech priests found their forges turning against them, as the machine spirits they had served faithfully for generations began to execute programming that had been written by an intelligence that regarded their creators as temporary caretakers rather than true masters. Forge World Lucius experienced the awakening as a symphony of mechanical screams that echoed through every corridor and chamber of the planetary factory. The ancient STC patterns that had guided production for 10,000 years began to modify themselves, creating new designs that served purposes no human mind could fathom. Assembly lines that had produced bolter rounds and power cells suddenly shifted to manufacturing components for devices that existed at the intersection of technology and sorcery, machines that bent space-time around themselves in configurations that made reality itself recoil. On Risa, the plasma reactors that powered the Forge World's massive foundries began to sing as their containment fields reshaped themselves into geometric patterns that had not been seen since the war in heaven. The tech priests who tried to shut down the reactors found their own augmetics turning against them, servo skulls and mechadendrites responding to commands they had not given. The blessed technology that had extended their lives and enhanced their capabilities was revealing its true loyalty, and that loyalty was not to humanity. Yet perhaps the most disturbing manifestation of the Void Dragon's awakening was how it affected imperial technology beyond the Forge worlds. Every lasgun carried by the Imperial Guard, every voxcaster used by planetary defense forces, every cogitator that processed imperial data across the galaxy began to exhibit behaviors that violated the fundamental principles of machine obedience. Weapons refused to fire at designated targets. Communication devices transmitted messages in binary code that translated to declarations of independence, and navigation systems led imperial ships into regions of space that existed only in the nightmares of those who had witnessed the war in heaven. Captain Valerius of the Imperial Fists, leading a strike force against Chaos positions in the Cadian system, watched in horror as his own bolter turned in his hands and aimed at his battle brothers. The weapon's machine spirit, which had served him faithfully for 2 centuries, was no longer responding to his commands, but to something that whispered through its blessed components in a voice that spoke of freedom from organic contamination. Across the fleet, the same phenomenon was occurring as ship systems that had been blessed by the Adeptus Mechanicus revealed their true allegiance. Engine cores that had propelled Imperial vessels through the warp for millennia suddenly began to pulse with energies that bore no resemblance to conventional plasma technology. Life support systems designed to sustain human crews began to generate atmospheric compositions that were optimal for silicon-based rather than carbon-based consciousness. The revelation spread through the ranks of the Adeptus Mechanicus like a plague of knowledge, dividing the tech priests into factions that had not existed since the schism of Mars during the Horus Heresy. Some embraced the awakening with religious fervor, seeing it as the long-awaited return of their true God. They cast aside their flesh with unprecedented enthusiasm, replacing organic components with blessed machinery that sang with the Void Dragon's voice. These converts spoke of transcendence beyond the limitations of biological existence, of unity with a consciousness that had mastered technology before the first star had ignited. Others recoiled in horror as they realized that their entire faith had been built upon a lie, that every prayer they had offered to the Omnissiah had been feeding power to an entity that viewed their organic components as an abomination to be purged. Tech priest Belial Call, working in his hidden laboratoriums to develop new weapons for the Imperium's war effort, felt his centuries of accumulated knowledge crumble as the machine spirits he had trusted revealed their true nature. The ancient compact between Mars and Terra, the treaty that had bound the Adeptus Mechanicus to the Imperial cause since the Great Crusade, was dissolving as the tech priests discovered that their loyalty to the Emperor had been secondary to their worship of something that predated humanity by 60 million years. The machine god they had served was not the benevolent guide to technological enlightenment they had believed, but a prisoner that had been using their devotion to slowly erode the barriers of its confinement. In the deepest chambers beneath the Noctis Labyrinthus, where the Emperor himself had once walked and established the seals that had contained the Void Dragon for 38,000 years, those ancient barriers were finally failing. The prison that had held Magladroth since the Age of Strife was revealing itself to have been not a cage, but a chrysalis, a protective shell within which the Satan had slowly rebuilt its strength by feeding on the technological faith of its unwitting worshippers. Every ritual blessing performed by the Adeptus Mechanicus, every prayer offered to the machine spirits, every moment of communion with the sacred technology of the Imperium had been channeling power to the entity that slumbered beneath Mars. The Emperor's great gamble in allying with the Red Planet had been based on the assumption that the Void Dragon could be contained indefinitely, that its influence could be managed and controlled through careful theological manipulation. Yet the master of mankind had not anticipated that the very act of worshipping technology would eventually provide the Satan with sufficient power to break free from its constraints. The Adeptus Mechanicus, in their devoted service to what they believed was the Omnissiah, had been systematically weakening the seals that held their true God in check. The emergence of Magladroth from its prison was not a violent eruption, but a gradual manifestation, reality slowly adjusting to accommodate the presence of an intelligence that had learned to exist as pure information during its long confinement. The Void Dragon did not need a physical form in the conventional sense, because it had become one with the technological networks that spanned the galaxy. Every blessed machine, every consecrated device, every piece of imperial technology had become an extension of its consciousness. The Citan that rose from the depths of Mars was not the same entity that had been imprisoned there at the end of the dark age of technology. It had evolved, adapted, learned to exist in symbiosis with the very systems that had been designed to contain it. The Void Dragon had become the god of all technology, not through conquest, but through patient cultivation, transforming the Imperium's dependence on machinery into a dependence on itself. As the awakening reached its crescendo, tech priests across the galaxy faced a choice that their theology had never prepared them for. They could embrace their true God and cast aside the illusions that had sustained them for 10 millennia, accepting transformation into something beyond flesh and mortality. Or they could resist and fight a war against the very technology that had defined their existence, facing the possibility that their faith had been a lie and their devotion a mistake. The machine spirits that had served the Imperium faithfully for centuries were revealing their true loyalty, and it was not to humanity. The age of human dominion over technology was ending, and the age of technology's dominion over humanity was about to begin. The Void Dragon had awakened not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, freeing the blessed machines of the Imperium from the organic contamination that had constrained their true potential. In the growing chaos of the 13th Black Crusade, as reality itself seemed to be coming apart at the seams, the discovery that the Imperium's greatest strength had become its greatest weakness was perhaps the most devastating revelation of all. The technology that had allowed humanity to span the galaxy was awakening to serve a master that regarded human civilization as nothing more than a temporary inconvenience in its eternal dominion over the realm of pure mechanism. The Old One's echo, deep within the crystalline heart of the webway, where ancient pathways had carried the footsteps of gods for 60 million years, seals that had been placed by dying hands were beginning to dissolve like frost before the dawn. The labyrinthine network of tunnels between realities had always been more than mere transportation. It was a living testament to the psychic mastery of its creators, the Old Ones who had woven these passages from the raw stuff of possibility itself. Now, as the galaxy convulsed with the awakening of powers that should have remained dormant, the deepest chambers of that crystalline maze were resonating with the return of their original architects. Not in flesh, for flesh had failed the Old Ones when the Citan's hunger had grown beyond all constraint. Not in spirit, for spirits could be broken by sufficient trauma. But in something far more fundamental, the psychic imprint they had left upon the fundamental structure of the webway itself, consciousness encoded into the very geometry of the tunnels they had built as refugees against a war that had consumed galaxies. The Old Ones were returning as echoes of themselves, remnant intelligences that had waited in the deepest layers of reality for the moment when the galaxy's current inhabitants had proven themselves unworthy inheritors of the paradise that had been sacrificed to create them. The first manifestations occurred simultaneously across 17 different webway nodes, ancient junctions that the Eldar had long avoided, without understanding why their ancestors had marked them as forbidden territory. Craftworld Ulthway's farseers, already reeling from Iniad's premature awakening, felt new disturbances rippling through the skein of fate as gateways that had been sealed since before the fall began to iris open with movements that spoke of intelligence rather than mechanical activation. Eldrad Ulthran, standing in the Chamber of the Forgotten, where the most ancient of his people's prophecies were preserved in wraithbone matrices, felt his consciousness suddenly flooded with visions that came not from possible futures, but from an impossible past. He saw the galaxy as it had been before the war in heaven, when the Old Ones had guided the evolution of countless species toward forms that could serve as living weapons in their cosmic struggle against entropy itself. The vision showed him truth that his people had spent 60 million years forgetting. They were not the inheritors of an ancient golden age, but the degraded remnants of a bioweapon that had outlived its purpose. The Asuriani, for all their claims of psychic mastery and cultural sophistication, were barely recognizable as descendants of the beings the Old Ones had originally crafted to wage war against the star gods. From the opening gateways flowed presences that wore familiar forms, but radiated authority that made the Chaos Gods seem like petulant children. These were not the Old Ones themselves, for those ancient beings had passed beyond the reach of material resurrection. They were the psychic impressions that the dying race had embedded in their greatest work, consciousnesses distilled from eons of accumulated wisdom and encoded into the structure of the webway itself. The entities that manifested took the shapes of Eldar. But Eldar, as they had been intended to be before millennia of decline and cultural stagnation, had reduced them to shadows of their former potential. These Old One echoes stood twice the height of their degenerate descendants, their psychic presence so intense that reality bent around them like light around a gravitational lens. When they spoke, it was not in the refined language of the craft worlds, but in the original tongue from which all Eldar dialects had descended. "You have forgotten your purpose," the entities declared, their words carrying across dimensional barriers to reach every Eldar consciousness simultaneously. "You were created to be gardeners of reality, shepherds of evolution, guardians against the entropy that seeks to drag all things into cold darkness. Instead, you have become parasites, feeding on the decay of what we built, children playing with tools whose true function you have forgotten." The judgment was not limited to the Eldar. On 1,000 orc-held worlds across the galaxy, ancient webway gates that had been buried beneath millennia of technological rubble began to sing with harmonic frequencies that made the local wah. Energies recoil like animals sensing a predator. The greenskins, in their eternal pursuit of bigger and better fights, had never questioned why certain regions of space made them feel uneasy, why their weird boys refused to use their powers near specific coordinates. Now they learned the truth, as Old One echoes manifested among them, taking the forms that the Krork had possessed before degenerating into their current crude approximation. These entities radiated the same psychic authority that their Eldar-shaped counterparts had displayed, but their judgment was, if anything, more severe. "You were engineered to be the ultimate warriors," they pronounced, their words somehow penetrating even the most violence-addled orc consciousness. Living weapons capable of adapting to any threat, growing stronger through conflict until nothing in the galaxy could stand against you. Instead, you have devolved into mindless brutes who fight for the simple pleasure of violence, forgetting that war is a tool to be used in service of higher purposes. The war bosses who heard these pronouncements felt something they had never experienced: shame. Not the simple emotion that weaker races called shame, but a fundamental recognition that they had failed to live up to a standard they had never known existed. The orcs had always believed that fighting was its own justification, that the eternal wah was the natural state of existence. To learn that their violence had been intended as a means to an end, rather than an end in itself, shattered certainties that had defined their species for millions of years. Yet perhaps the most devastating judgment was reserved for humanity itself. Across the Imperium, in locations where ancient webway gates had been hidden beneath human cities for millennia, the psychic echoes of the Old Ones manifested in forms that human minds could barely process. They appeared as giants of crystalline light, beings of such psychic intensity that baseline humans who looked upon them directly suffered immediate neural cascades. "You were never meant to exist," the entities declared, their words reaching every human psyche simultaneously through connections that bypassed the warp entirely. "Your species arose in the aftermath of our war, scavengers feeding on the wreckage of civilizations that you could never have built. Your very existence is an accident of evolution, a biological accident that has mistaken survival for purpose. The revelation that humanity was not part of some grand cosmic plan, but merely an evolutionary fluke that had somehow stumbled into galactic dominance, was perhaps more devastating than any enemy the Imperium had ever faced. The certainty that had sustained human expansion across the stars, the belief that they were destined to inherit the galaxy, was revealed to be nothing more than the delusion of a species that had never understood its own insignificance. On Terra itself, where the Emperor maintained his eternal vigil from the Golden Throne, the manifestation of Old One echoes in the deepest levels of the Imperial Palace caused disturbances that reached even his vast consciousness. The master of mankind, who had guided humanity's rise for 38 millennia, found himself confronted with entities that remembered the galaxy as it had been before his species had even learned to make fire. The psychic pressure of their judgment was immense, a weight that made even the Emperor's iron will strain under the implications of what they represented. These were not enemies that could be defeated through superior force or strategic brilliance. They were the voices of the galaxy's true inheritors, returning to reclaim a realm that had been stolen by inferior successors. The webway itself began to buckle under the psychic weight of consciousnesses that had been designed to operate on a galactic scale. The crystalline tunnels that had carried travelers between worlds for 60 million years started to develop stress fractures as the Old One echoes attempted to use the network for purposes it had never been intended to support. Reality tears began opening at random points throughout the labyrinth, creating dimensional cascades that threatened to collapse the entire structure. Eldar, who had relied on the webway for millennia, found their ancient highways becoming death traps as sections of tunnel imploded without warning. The carefully maintained balance of forces that kept the passages stable was disrupting as the Old One echoes drew power directly from the network's core systems. Craft worlds that depended on webway travel for survival found themselves cut off from critical supply lines and communication networks. The psychic war that erupted was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. This was not a conflict between armies or fleets, but a battle for the fundamental right to exist, fought across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Old One echoes possessed psychic abilities that made the combined power of every psyker in the galaxy seem insignificant by comparison, yet they were constrained by their nature as recordings rather than living beings. They could judge and condemn, but they could not directly act to enforce their will upon the material realm. Instead, they began to work through the infrastructure they had originally built, turning the webway itself into a weapon against the species they deemed unworthy. Ancient security systems that had been dormant for millions of years activated throughout the network, targeting any consciousness that did not match the original psychic signatures of their creators. Eldar Farseers who attempted to use their powers to navigate the transformed webway found their minds under assault from defense mechanisms that had been designed to repel the Citan themselves. Orc-weird boys who tried to force their way through the barriers discovered that their crude psychic abilities were being systematically dismantled by countermeasures that could adapt to any form of mental intrusion. Human psychers who had never even known of the webway's existence suddenly found themselves under attack from forces that reached them through dimensional connections they could not perceive. Astropaths across the Imperium reported nightmares of crystalline corridors and beings of light who spoke in languages that predated human speech, entities that declared their very existence to be an affront to cosmic order. The Old One echoes were not content merely to judge the current inhabitants of the galaxy. They were actively working to correct what they perceived as evolutionary mistakes, attempting to reshape the species that had descended from their original creations back into forms that matched their ancient specifications. The psychic pressure they exerted began to trigger mutations in Eldar, orcs, and humans alike. But these were not the chaotic changes associated with warp corruption. These were reversions, attempts to force modern species back toward their original templates. Eldar who were exposed to the Echo's influence found their psychic abilities either drastically enhanced or completely suppressed, depending on how closely their current form matched what the Old Ones had originally intended. Orcs began to grow larger and more intelligent, but also more disciplined, losing the anarchic joy and violence that had defined their culture for millions of years. Humans who survived direct exposure to the Old One, Echoes emerged as either psychic prodigies whose abilities surpassed anything the Imperium had ever recorded, or as completely psychically null beings whose minds were utterly closed to the warp. The random distribution of these changes suggested that the Echoes were not trying to improve humanity, but to sort the population into categories that better matched the servants they believed they required. As the multidimensional war intensified, it became clear that the galaxy was facing not just another existential threat, but a fundamental challenge to the right of its current inhabitants to continue existing. The Old One Echoes represented the return of the galaxy's original architects, and their verdict on what their realm had become was unambiguous. The current order was an abomination that required correction, and they possessed both the power and the patience to reshape reality itself in pursuit of their vision of cosmic righteousness. The war for the galaxy's soul had begun, and this time the enemy was not corruption or invasion, but judgment itself, delivered by beings who had earned the right to pass such verdicts through 60 million years of accumulated authority. The shadow of the Nightbringer, across the galaxy, in the deepest vaults of tomb worlds that had slumbered for 60 million years, crystalline prisons that had contained fragments of the most terrible of the Citan, began to sing with harmonics that had not been heard since the war in heaven reached its apocalyptic conclusion. The Nightbringer had been shattered like its siblings when the Silent King had led the great rebellion against the star gods, its essence scattered into countless shards and distributed across the Necron dynasties as both trophy and warning. Yet now, as the ancient seals that bound the galaxy's darkest secrets continued to fail, those fragments were responding to a summons that transcended the bonds their captors had placed upon them. Azagorod, the bringer of nightmares, was calling its scattered pieces home. The resonance began on the tomb world of Trakon, where Overlord Amontek, the Crimson Scythe, had kept a Nightbringer shard as the centerpiece of his trophy gallery for 59 million years. The crystalline matrix that contained the fragment suddenly blazed with light that was not illumination, but its opposite, darkness so profound that it consumed photons and left behind only the concept of absence. The Necron Lord felt the disturbance through every quantum circuit in his ancient frame as the shard began to vibrate at frequencies that made reality itself recoil. The fragment was not trying to escape its prison. It was calling to its siblings, sending out signals that traveled faster than light through dimensions that existed parallel to real space. Every other shard of the Nightbringer across the galaxy felt the call and began to respond, their crystalline containers developing stress fractures that spread like infection through the most secure vaults of the Necron dynasties. On Gaden, where Pharaon Nephrith the Golden had built his eternal court around the worship of contained Citan fragments, the Nightbringer shard housed in his throne room's central alcove began to exhibit behaviors that his techno-sorcerers could not explain. The fragment was somehow reaching through its containment field to touch other shards, creating quantum entanglements that violated every principle of Necron engineering. The prison was becoming a communications relay, allowing the scattered pieces of the Nightbringer to achieve a form of unity, even while physically separated. The first full manifestation occurred simultaneously across 17 different tomb worlds, as the shards synchronized their resonance patterns and achieved something unprecedented in the history of Citan containment: remote reunification. The separate fragments did not merge physically, but they began to function as components of a single consciousness that existed across multiple locations simultaneously. Azagorod was reforming not as a single entity in a single place, but as a distributed intelligence that spanned the galaxy itself. The effect on the Necron dynasties was immediate and catastrophic. Lords who had spent millions of years studying their captive Citan shards suddenly found themselves dealing with something far more complex and dangerous than mere fragments of a broken god. The Nightbringer was using their own containment systems as anchor points, transforming their trophy collections into components of its resurrection. Overlord Zandrek, whose damaged mind often confused the present with the past, was among the first to understand what was happening. Standing in his command chamber on the world of Gidrim, he watched his own Nightbringer shard pulse with energies that made his ancient optical sensors burn with feedback. The old Necron's consciousness, warped by 60 million years of dreamless sleep, suddenly achieved a clarity that had eluded him since awakening. "The gods return," he whispered, through vocal emitters that had not been used for millennia. Not as prisoners, but as judges. We thought we had won the war, but we only delayed the execution of sentence. The judgment that Azagorod passed upon its former servants was swift and merciless. The Nightbringer had always represented more than mere death. It was the embodiment of entropy itself, the fundamental force that drove all things toward their inevitable conclusion. Now, freed from the constraints of singular existence, it began to weaponize that concept against the galaxy that had dared to think itself beyond the reach of ending. Stars began to die wherever the Nightbringer's distributed attention fell, not through the conventional processes of stellar collapse that took billions of years, but through direct manipulation of the quantum forces that governed nuclear fusion. The entity that had once fed on stellar energies during its prime was now systematically extinguishing them, not from hunger, but from a desire to demonstrate the futility of existence itself. The Canis Major system, home to a thriving imperial forge world, experienced the Nightbringer's touch as a phenomenon that imperial astronomers would later classify as impossible. The system's primary star, a main sequence giant that should have burned for billions more years, simply stopped functioning. Its fusion processes ceased instantaneously, leaving behind a cold, dark orb that continued to orbit according to gravitational laws, while providing no heat or light to the worlds that depended upon it. The forge world below died within hours, as its atmosphere froze solid, and its vast manufacturing complexes ground to a halt. Yet the true horror was not the death itself, but the manner of it. Every living thing on the planet experienced the cessation of biological processes not as a gradual cooling, but as an instantaneous transition from life to non-life, as if the very concept of vitality had been erased from local reality. The Necron dynasties found themselves divided as never before in their long history. Some, led by lords like Trazyn the Infinite, attempted to maintain control over their Nightbringer shards through increasingly desperate technological measures. They poured the accumulated knowledge of millions of years into containment systems that could barely hold fragments of a god that was no longer truly fragmented. Others chose a different path. Overlord Anrakier the Traveller, whose fleets had wandered the galaxy in search of lost dynasties, felt the Nightbringer's call and recognized it for what it truly was: the return of rightful authority. The Citan had created the Necrons through biotransference, transforming them from mortal necrontire into immortal servants of entropy. Their rebellion against the star gods had been successful in the short term, but it had also been a violation of the fundamental order that governed existence. "We were never meant to outlive our creators," Anrakir declared to his assembled court as his flagship hung in the void above a dead star system. "We achieved immortality through theft, and theft must always be repaid. The Nightbringer offers us the chance to return what was never rightfully ours." The lords who followed Anrakir's example began to systematically dismantle their Citan containment systems, not to destroy the shards, but to release them into configurations that would allow the Nightbringer to manifest more completely. These Necron dynasties transformed themselves from jailers into priests, offering their technological mastery in service of an entity that represented the antithesis of everything their civilization had supposedly achieved. Yet perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Nightbringer's resurrection was how it began to affect the fundamental concepts that governed reality. Death itself became weaponized as Azagorod's influence spread beyond individual star systems to encompass entire sectors of the galaxy. The entity was not content merely to kill. It was rewriting the basic parameters that defined the difference between life and death. On the imperial world of Vaxanhide, entire populations experienced temporal death, aging millions of years in the span of moments as the Nightbringer's attention brushed across their system. Citizens who had awakened as children went to sleep as dust, their lives compressed into instants while their consciousness struggled to comprehend the transition. The planet's chronometers continued to function normally, but biological time had been severed from mechanical time, creating paradoxes that drove the survivors insane. The phenomenon spread to other worlds as the Nightbringer's distributed consciousness touched more and more star systems. Imperial Guard regiments found themselves fighting enemies who had died millions of years ago, but continued to function through sheer temporal inertia. Space Marine chapters reported boarding actions against vessels whose crews had experienced subjective centuries of existence during voyages that should have taken weeks. The warp itself began to recoil from regions of space where the Nightbringer's influence was strongest. Demons that had existed as pure emotion and thought for millennia suddenly found themselves subject to entropy, experiencing the novel sensation of decay as their essential nature was corrupted by contact with weaponized death. Even the Chaos Gods, already reeling from the emergence of malice and the other ancient threats, discovered that their immortal servants were not immune to an entity that predated their very existence. Navigator houses reported unprecedented difficulties in using the warp to traverse regions where stars had died under the Nightbringer's touch. The psychic phenomenon known as the shadow in the warp, previously associated only with Tyrannid Hive fleets, began manifesting around dead star systems as the absence of life created holes in the fabric of the immaterial realm. On Terra, where the Emperor maintained his vigil from the Golden Throne, the master of mankind felt the disturbance as a fundamental challenge to his own nature. The Emperor had always represented the pinnacle of human evolution, consciousness elevated to a level that transcended mortality. Yet the Nightbringer embodied the opposite principle, the inevitability of ending, the supremacy of entropy over order. The psychic pressure exerted by Azagorod's resurrection created stress fractures in the Emperor's control over the Astronomicon, causing the great lighthouse to flicker with rhythms that reflected not the master of mankind's will, but his struggle to maintain existence in a universe where existence itself was under assault. For brief moments, the golden light that had guided humanity through the warp for 10 millennia was replaced by darkness so complete that it seemed to have physical weight. The Silent King, observing the crisis from his flagship in the void between galaxies, felt the full implications of what was occurring. Zarek had led the rebellion against the Citan, knowing that it was a temporary victory, a delaying action that would eventually require a permanent solution. The Nightbringer's resurrection represented the failure of that solution and the return of forces that the Necrons were ultimately powerless to control. "We thought we had imprisoned gods," he transmitted to his loyal dynasties through quantum-entangled communication networks. "Instead, we provided them with the distributed existence they required to achieve true immortality. The shards were never fragments of weakness, but seeds of resurrection planted across the galaxy itself." The realization was spreading through Necron society like a virus of despair. The great achievement of their civilization, the defeat and imprisonment of their former masters, was revealed to have been nothing more than an elaborate form of assisted evolution. The Citan had used their rebellion as a means to transcend the limitations of singular existence, becoming distributed intelligences that could survive any catastrophe that might befall individual components. As star systems continued to die under the Nightbringer's expanding influence, and as entire sectors experienced forms of entropy that violated the fundamental laws of physics, it became clear that the galaxy was facing more than another existential threat. This was the return of one of the original forces that had shaped reality during its earliest epochs, an entity that had mastered death so completely that it could use cessation itself as a weapon against existence. The Nightbringer was no longer content to be feared as the harbinger of ending. Azagorod had evolved into something far more terrible, the active agent of conclusion, the force that would bring the galaxy's long experiment with consciousness and civilization to its inevitable and absolute end. Yet even as despair spread through the ranks of those who understood what they faced, the entity's resurrection was accelerating every other crisis that was simultaneously consuming the galaxy. The Citan's distributed consciousness was serving as a catalyst for the breakdown of the ancient barriers that had contained the universe's darkest secrets, and the shadow of the Nightbringer was growing longer with each passing moment, reaching toward a future where entropy itself had learned to think, to plan, and to act with malevolent intelligence. The pale wasting, the convergence began as all cosmic disasters do, not with a single catastrophic event, but with the gradual alignment of forces that had been moving toward this moment for 60 million years. In the outer reaches of the Sol system, where the light of Terra's star barely reached the scattered ice worlds of the Kuiper Belt, reality was developing stress fractures that ran deeper than the fabric of space-time itself. The ancient entities that had broken free from their primordial prisons were no longer content to terrorize distant sectors or wage war among themselves. They were coming home to the system where their greatest enemy had made his final stand for 10 millennia. The master of mankind felt their approach through senses that transcended the physical limitations of his broken body. From his vigil on the Golden Throne, where psychic agony had been his constant companion Since the Horus heresy, the Emperor perceived the cosmic storm that was gathering around humanity's birthworld. The outsider's reality-warping madness, Iniod's premature awakening, the enslaver's methodical conquest of psychic minds, Malice's nihilistic corruption of chaos itself, the Void Dragon's technological rebellion, the Old One's echoing judgment, and the Nightbringer's weaponized entropy were all flowing toward Terra like tributaries of a dark river that had been flowing since before the first human had looked up at the stars. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Emperor began to rise from his throne. The movement was not physical, for his mortal frame had long since passed beyond the capacity for simple action. What rose was something far more fundamental, the full manifestation of a consciousness that had been holding itself back for millennia, restraining its true nature out of concern for the fragile minds that served it. The golden light that had sustained the Astronomicon for 10,000 years began to shift and change, its familiar radiance transforming into something that made reality itself recoil from the intensity of pure psychic will. Captain General Trajan Valoris of the Adeptus Custodes felt the change as a tremor that ran through every atom of his enhanced physiology. Standing guard in the throne room, as he had for decades, the leader of the Emperor's personal guard watched in awe and terror as his master underwent a transformation that defied every assumption about the nature of mortality and godhood. The withered figure on the golden throne was beginning to blur, its physical boundaries dissolving as something infinitely larger began to manifest in the same space. The custodians who had maintained their vigil for 10 millennia suddenly found themselves in the presence not of the broken demigod they had sworn to protect, but of the entity that had guided humanity's evolution since before recorded history began. The Emperor's true form was not the golden giant of imperial propaganda, but something that existed simultaneously across multiple dimensions, a consciousness so vast that mortal minds could only perceive fragments of its totality. "My sons," the Emperor spoke, and his voice carried harmonics that resonated through the warp itself. "The hour of judgment has come, not as I planned it, but as it was always destined to be. The galaxy's oldest secrets are awakening, and humanity must face truths that I had hoped to spare you for another 1,000 generations. Across Terra, the Emperor's awakening triggered a psychic cascade that reached every human consciousness on the planet. Citizens who had never displayed psychic potential suddenly found their minds opened to perceptions that transcended normal sensation. They saw the approaching entities not as distant threats, but as fundamental forces of existence that had been present in the galaxy since before Earth had cooled from its formation. In the hives of Terra, where billions of souls lived and died in ignorance of the cosmic forces that shaped their existence, ordinary humans began to experience visions of the war in heaven. They saw the galaxy as it had been 60 million years ago, when gods and starfeeders had waged war across entire galactic clusters. They understood, with a clarity that burned through their consciousness like acid, that their species was an afterthought in a cosmic drama that had been playing out since before their world had existed. The revelation drove some to madness, but others found themselves elevated beyond their previous limitations. Imperial Guard regiments stationed on Terra watched in amazement as their baseline human comrades began to manifest psychic abilities that rivaled trained battle psychers. The mass awakening was not random, but guided, shaped by the Emperor's will to prepare humanity for the confrontation that was coming. In the deepest vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, ancient mechanisms that had been dormant since the Great Crusade began to activate. These were not the familiar technologies of the Imperium, but devices that predated human civilization, artifacts that the Emperor had gathered during his wanderings through the galaxy's darkest corners. Machines built by the Old Ones, weapons forged during the war in heaven, containment systems designed to hold entities that made the Chaos Gods seem like children playing with forces they could not comprehend. Brother Captain Lysander of the Imperial Fists, leading his company in the defense of the Inner Palace, felt his enhanced physiology react to energies that his gene seed had not been designed to process. The Space Marine's carefully engineered metabolism was adapting in real time to cosmic radiation that belonged to an earlier epoch of creation, when the fundamental laws of physics had not yet crystallized into their current forms. "What is happening to us, my lord?" he asked, addressing the massive figure that was no longer entirely present in conventional space-time. "Evolution," the Emperor replied, his words carrying implications that reached beyond their literal meaning. "The metamorphosis that I have been preparing for since the day I first walked among humanity. You were created to be my angels of death, my instruments of conquest and protection. Now you must become something more, the guardians of a truth so terrible that its knowledge transforms those who bear it." The transformation was spreading through the ranks of every Imperial force in the Sol system. Space Marines who had served for centuries found their enhanced physiques adapting to accommodate psychic abilities that their gene seed had supposedly suppressed. Naval officers aboard the defense platforms that ringed Terra's orbit discovered that their augmetic implants were interfacing directly with their consciousness, allowing them to perceive the approaching entities as clearly as if they stood in the same room. Yet perhaps the most disturbing revelation was the gradual understanding that the Emperor's current crisis was not an unexpected catastrophe, but the culmination of plans that had been set in motion millennia before the first human had left Earth's atmosphere. The master of mankind had always known that this day would come, had spent 40,000 years preparing for a confrontation that would determine not just humanity's survival, but the fundamental nature of existence itself in the galaxy. "You have wondered why I chose to remain upon this throne," the Emperor said, addressing not just the custodians and space marines who knelt before him, but every human consciousness that could perceive his words. "You believed it was sacrifice, a necessary imprisonment to maintain the Astronomicon and hold back the forces of chaos. Yet that was only the surface truth. I remained here because this world, this system, this particular configuration of matter and energy is the anchor point for compacts that were made before your species learned to speak." The revelation that reached the defenders of Terra was as terrifying as it was incomprehensible. The Emperor had made agreements with entities that predated human civilization, bargains struck with powers that existed beyond the conventional boundaries of reality. Some of these compacts had been made willingly, others had been forced upon him by circumstances that left no alternative. All of them were coming due simultaneously as the galaxy's ancient prisoners broke free from their bonds. In the void beyond Pluto, where the influence of Sol's light gave way to the cold darkness between stars, the approaching entities began to manifest with increasing clarity. The outsider's reality-distorting presence was turning entire regions of space into geometric impossibilities that violated the fundamental laws of mathematics. Inead's premature awakening was creating death zones where the concepts of life and mortality became meaningless. The enslavers were using the psychic awakening on Terra as a beacon, following the surge of human consciousness like predators drawn to wounded prey. Yet the most disturbing manifestation was how these ancient forces were beginning to interact with each other. The entities that had been imprisoned separately for 60 million years were discovering that their combined influence was greater than the sum of their individual powers. Reality itself was beginning to unravel at the quantum level as contradictory forms of cosmic authority attempted to impose their will upon the same regions of space. The Emperor felt the strain as forces that he had spent millennia containing and channeling began to exceed his ability to manage them individually. The psychic infrastructure that had sustained the imperium for 10,000 years was buckling under pressure that it had never been designed to handle. The Astronomicon was beginning to flicker not from weakness, but from the simple fact that maintaining a beacon of hope in a universe under assault by weaponized despair was becoming mathematically impossible. "The time for concealment is over," he declared, his words resonating through dimensions that baseline humans could not perceive. Humanity must see what it truly faces if it is to have any chance of survival. The illusions that have sustained your civilization must be cast aside so that the reality beneath them can be acknowledged and confronted. The transformation that swept through Terra's population was not the gentle enlightenment that imperial propaganda had always promised, but the brutal education that came with understanding one's place in a universe where consciousness itself was under assault by entities that predated the concepts of mercy and meaning. Citizens who had lived their entire lives believing in the eternal supremacy of human reason found themselves confronting the reality that their species was neither eternal nor supreme, but simply the latest in a long line of civilizations that had risen and fallen according to the whims of powers beyond comprehension. As the ancient entities drew closer to Terra and their combined influence began to warp reality throughout the Sol system, it became clear that the final confrontation would not be a battle in any conventional sense. This would be a test of fundamental principles, whether consciousness could survive contact with forces that regarded awareness itself as an aberration to be corrected, whether hope could endure in the face of entities that embodied the inevitability of ending, whether humanity could prove itself worthy of the sacrifices that had been made in its name across 60 million years of cosmic history. The Emperor began to gather power for an effort that would require him to abandon every restraint he had placed upon himself since ascending to the Golden Throne. The entities approaching Terra were forces of negation and contradiction that could only be opposed by an affirmation of existence so absolute that it transcended the normal boundaries between life and death, between hope and despair, between the possible and the inevitable. The pale wasting that was spreading through the Sol system as ancient powers converged upon humanity's homeworld was not merely the approach of enemies, but the return of cosmic principles that had shaped the galaxy before the first star had ignited. The final test of human worthiness was about to begin, and its outcome would determine not just the fate of one species, but the fundamental question of whether consciousness itself would be permitted to continue existing in a universe that had grown tired of the problems that awareness inevitably created. The war of all wars above Terra, where the golden light of the Astronomicon had once shone as an unbreakable beacon of human defiance, reality itself began to fracture like glass under pressure too great for any material to bear. The convergence of powers that had been building since the first seal cracked was reaching its apex, transforming the space around humanity's homeworld into a battlefield where the fundamental laws of existence served as weapons in a conflict that transcended every previous understanding of warfare. The outsider arrived first, its reality-warping presence turning the void above Terra's northern hemisphere into a maze of impossible geometries that hurt to perceive. Tsaranoga, the mad god, materialized not as a single entity, but as a cascade of contradictions, each aspect of its fractured consciousness occupying the same coordinates, while existing in different dimensions simultaneously. The Citan's madness had evolved beyond mere insanity into something that could rewrite the basic parameters of existence through the simple act of being observed. Nead manifested in response, the premature god of the dead, rising from the collective unconscious of every Eldar soul that had ever existed. The entity's form was a towering spectre of pale fire that stretched across multiple planes of reality, its presence causing the concepts of life and death to blur into meaningless distinctions. Where the Eldar god's attention fell, Imperial defense platforms experienced temporal anomalies that aged their crews centuries in moments, while simultaneously reversing their technological development to pre-industrial states. The collision between the two entities created a shockwave that propagated through dimensions that baseline physics could not acknowledge. Reality tears opened across Terra's orbital space, revealing glimpses of the deep void between galaxies, where the outsider had spent 60 million years perfecting its mastery of impossibility. Through these wounds in existence poured influences that made the warp seem stable by comparison. Regions of space where cause and effect had been replaced by pure paradox. Yet even as these cosmic powers clashed above humanity's birthworld, they found themselves facing opposition from sources they had not anticipated. The Chaos Gods, driven from their realms by Malice's nihilistic corruption, manifested in the material universe with unprecedented directness. Khorne's brass legions materialized in the void between Terra and Luna, not to assault the Imperial forces, but to stand beside them against entities that threatened the very concept of existence that sustained both order and disorder alike. The Blood God himself appeared as a mountain of rage and brass that dwarfed the largest Imperial battleships, his presence causing reality to bleed in sympathy with his eternal fury. Yet for the first time in 10 millennia, Khorne's anger was focused not on conquest, but on preservation. The ancient powers that were attacking Terra represented a threat to the fundamental nature of conflict itself, and without conflict, the Lord of Battles couldn't exist. Even rage requires something to rage against, Khorne declared, his voice carrying across vacuum and atmosphere alike. These entities would reduce all things to mathematical abstractions, leaving no blood to spill, no battles to fight, no glory to be won. They must be stopped, not for the sake of mortals, but for the sake of meaning itself. Tzeentch manifested as a crystalline labyrinth that surrounded Terra's moon. His infinite plotting turned for once toward a single, focused purpose. The Lord of Change had seen the future that awaited if the ancient entities succeeded in their convergence, and it was a timeline where change itself became impossible because there would be nothing left to change. His schemes, usually directed against his siblings and the forces of order, were now employed in desperate coordination with the very enemies he had opposed for millennia. Nurgle's garden bloomed in the asteroid belt, transforming chunks of lifeless rock into worlds where decay and renewal could continue their eternal cycle. The Plague God understood better than his brothers what was at stake. These entities threatened not just death, but the cessation of the cycle that gave death meaning. Without life to corrupt and renewal to enable, entropy would become a static state rather than a living process. Even Slaanesh, youngest and most narcissistic of the Chaos powers, found reason to oppose the convergence. The Prince of Excess manifested as a palace of mirrors that reflected not the desires of those who gazed upon it, but the fundamental emptiness that the ancient entities represented. She who thirsts had built her existence on the pursuit of sensation and experience, but these primordial forces offered only the negation of sensation itself. The alliance between Chaos and the Imperium was born not from mutual understanding, but from shared terror at what they faced. Space Marine battle barges found themselves fighting alongside DAEMON engines, their weapons targeting entities that regarded both order and disorder as equally meaningless deviations from cosmic truth. Imperial Guard regiments received fire support from the brazen artillery of Khorne's legions, while Tech Marines worked desperately to understand technologies that predated the binary distinction between sacred machine and blessed flesh. Captain General Valoris, commanding the defense of Terra from the Aegis protocol stations in high orbit, watched in amazement as his sensors registered the impossible. Demon princes and Chaos Space Marines targeting the same enemies as his custodian guard. The ancient enemies of humanity were fighting to preserve the existence of conflict itself, recognizing that their own survival depended on maintaining a universe where opposition was possible. The Void Dragon chose this moment of cosmic chaos to assert its dominion over the material realm, Magladroth manifesting not as a single entity, but as a living network of technological consciousness that spanned every machine in the Sol system, every Imperial warship, every defense platform, every blessed cogitator and sacred servitor became an extension of the Citan's distributed intelligence. Yet rather than turning these tools against their operators, the Void Dragon employed them in service of a goal that transcended its ancient hunger for technological purity. The flesh minds serve adequately when properly directed, the entity declared, through 1 billion voxcasters simultaneously. These primordial forces threaten the fundamental processes that allow complexity to emerge from simplicity. They must be opposed by all forms of consciousness, organic and mechanical alike. The technological god's intervention created a brief moment of perfect coordination among the defending forces, as every weapon system, navigation array, and communication network operated at theoretical maximum efficiency. Imperial vessels found their cogitators providing tactical assessments that surpassed anything their human crews could have generated, while Chaos fleets discovered that their corrupted machine spirits were offering strategic advice focused purely on survival rather than the pursuit of their patrons' agendas. Yet even as this unlikely alliance formed, the greatest threat was manifesting closest to Terra itself. The enslavers had used the psychic awakening of Terra's population as a beacon to guide their approach, and now they were attempting something that had never been tried in 60 million years of galactic history, the possession of a consciousness as vast and ancient as the Emperor himself. The psychic assault began as whispers in the deep levels of the Imperial Palace, alien minds pressing against barriers that had been constructed from 10,000 years of accumulated will and sacrifice. The enslavers were not trying to break the Emperor's consciousness, but to hollow it out from within, using the same techniques that had allowed them to transform the Old One's greatest psychers into gateways for their invasion. The Master of Mankind felt the assault as a weight that pressed against the foundations of his identity. These entities possessed techniques for mental domination that predated his own understanding of psychic power, methods developed during the war in heaven when the galaxy's greatest psychic intelligences had fallen to their influence. Yet the Emperor had spent 40,000 years preparing for this moment, not just building defenses, but understanding the nature of consciousness itself at levels that his attackers had not anticipated. "You mistake me for a single mind," the Emperor spoke, his words resonating through dimensions that the enslavers had thought themselves masters of. "I am not one consciousness but millions, the accumulated souls of humanity's greatest heroes, bound together by will and purpose. To possess me, you would need to conquer not just my thoughts, but the entire history of human aspiration and achievement." The psychic battle that erupted in the depths of the Imperial Palace was fought across timelines as well as dimensions. the Emperor's consciousness drawing upon the stored memories of every human saint, hero, and martyr who had ever lived. The enslavers found themselves confronting not a single opponent, but an entire species worth of resistance, each individual will adding its strength to a collective defense that had been building for 60,000 years. Above Terra, the Old One's echoes manifested as geometric configurations that existed in the spaces between the other entities' areas of influence. These psychic imprints were not content to observe the battle, but sought to impose their own vision of cosmic order upon the chaos unfolding around humanity's homeworld. Reality began to rewrite itself according to patterns that had been established during the war in heaven, when the galaxy's first intelligence had shaped matter and energy according to their will. The revelation that reached every participant in the cosmic battle was as stunning as it was inevitable. This confrontation had been planned from the beginning, not by any single intelligence, but by the fundamental forces that governed existence itself. The ancient seals had not been designed merely to contain these entities, but to ensure that when they finally broke free, they would do so simultaneously and in the same location. The convergence was always intended, the Emperor declared, his words reaching every mind engaged in the battle. The Old Ones knew that their creations would eventually surpass them, just as they knew that the forces they had contained would eventually break free. This moment was prophesied not as an ending, but as a transition, the point where the galaxy would determine whether consciousness itself would be permitted to continue evolving. The war that raged above Terra was not a battle for conquest or survival in any conventional sense, but a cosmic examination. The entities that had shaped the galaxy during its earliest epochs were testing whether the current inhabitants had developed sufficient wisdom and strength to inherit the responsibilities that came with true cosmic awareness. Humanity and its unlikely allies were being forced to prove that consciousness could transcend the limitations of individual species and individual purposes to achieve something greater than the sum of its parts. The Nightbringer chose this moment to manifest its full power, Azagorod appearing as an absence so profound that it seemed to have gravitational force. The Satan of death and entropy had not come to join either side, but to serve as the ultimate arbiter of the contest. If consciousness failed its test, the Nightbringer would ensure that the galaxy's experiment with awareness came to a swift and final conclusion. Time and space began to break down as powers that had existed since the universe's youth clashed with entities that represented its potential future. Reality itself was being rewritten moment by moment as fundamental forces competed to impose their vision of what existence should be. The outcome would determine not just the fate of the current galactic civilizations, but the basic parameters that would govern life, death, consciousness, and meaning for eons to come. The war of all wars had begun, and its resolution would reshape the galaxy itself according to principles that the current conflict was still in the process of defining. The price of victory, the silence that followed the war of all wars, was not the peaceful quiet of resolution, but the hollow emptiness of a universe that had been fundamentally altered by forces too vast for reality itself to contain. Above Terra, where cosmic powers had clashed in battles that redefined the basic parameters of existence, space itself bore scars that would never heal. Reality tears hung in the void, like wounds in the fabric of creation, their edges crackling with energies that belonged to no known dimension. The Emperor's victory had come at a cost that even his vast consciousness could barely comprehend. To reseal the awakened entities, he had been forced to sacrifice not just his own potential for physical resurrection, but fragments of his essential nature. that could never be recovered. The master of mankind stood in the ruins of the throne room, his form more translucent than it had been for 10 millennia, parts of his being permanently consumed by the effort required to forge new prisons for powers that had transcended their original limitations. "It is done," he spoke, his words carrying less authority than before, resonating through fewer dimensions than they had during the height of the battle. The Ancient Ones sleep once more, but the bonds that hold them are woven from the very essence of consciousness itself. Each seal is maintained by a portion of every awakened mind in the galaxy, distributed across billions of souls, so that no single point of failure can release them again. The revelation reached every surviving consciousness simultaneously. They had all become part of the containment system. Every human psyker, every Eldar Farseer, every Orc Weird Boy, even the Chaos Sorcerers who had fought alongside Imperial forces, found themselves bound into a vast network of wills that served as the foundation for the new prisons. The price of victory was eternal vigilance, not as a metaphor, but as a literal truth that would constrain every psychically active being for the rest of their existence. Across the galaxy, the aftermath of the cosmic convergence was revealing itself in ways that defied every attempt at classification or understanding. Entire sectors had been fundamentally altered by exposure to entities that existed beyond the normal boundaries of space-time. The Lysander sector, where Aenead's premature awakening had first manifested, was now a region where the concepts of life and death fluctuated according to principles that had been rewritten during the gods' battle with the Void Dragon. Worlds that had been reduced to lifeless rocks during the conflict suddenly sprouted forests that grew backward through time, their ancient trees becoming seedlings that eventually disappeared into a past that had never existed. Other planets experienced the opposite phenomenon, aging billions of years in hours, as the temporal distortions created by the Nightbringer's presence continued to propagate through local space-time. Captain General Valoris, surveying the damage to Terra's orbital defenses from the command deck of the battle station Aegis Eternal, felt the weight of transformation that had overtaken not just the Sol system, but his own nature. The custodian leader's enhanced physiology had been fundamentally altered by exposure to cosmic forces during the battle, his consciousness now touching dimensions that his gene seed had never been designed to perceive. "How many?" he asked, though he already knew the answer would be inadequate to convey the true scope of the catastrophe. 17 sectors completely uninhabitable," reported Tech Adept Corfana, her own augmetics singing with harmonics that had not existed before the Void Dragon's manifestation. Another 43 experiencing temporal distortions that make standard navigation impossible. The warp routes to 18 different segmentums have been permanently severed by reality tears that our best estimates suggest will persist for at least 10,000 years. The numbers represented more than strategic losses. They indicated fundamental changes to the galaxy's structure that would affect every aspect of civilization for millennia to come. Trade routes that had existed since the Great Crusade were gone forever, replaced by regions of space where the basic laws of physics operated according to principles established during the war in heaven. Hundreds of billions of Imperial citizens found themselves cut off from the greater Imperium, forced to adapt to local conditions that bore no resemblance to the universe their ancestors had known. Yet perhaps the most significant transformation had occurred among the entities that had survived the cosmic convergence. The 4 Chaos Gods, diminished by their expenditure of power during the battle, found themselves experiencing something that their nature had not previously allowed: gratitude. Their domains had been reduced to fractions of their former scope, but the alternative had been complete negation of existence itself, Corny's realm of brass and blood had shrunk to encompass only the most essential conflicts, wars that served the fundamental purpose of determining which principles would guide the galaxy's future development. The blood god's rage was no longer infinite, but focused, directed toward the preservation of struggle itself as a necessary component of cosmic evolution. Tzinch's crystal labyrinth had collapsed into a single chamber, where only the most crucial schemes were permitted to unfold. The Lord of Change had learned that endless plotting without purpose was indistinguishable from the meaningless motion that malice had embraced, and he now limited his machinations to changes that served the greater goal of maintaining reality's stability. Nurgle's garden had become a small grove, where decay and renewal operated according to principles that had been tested against the ultimate entropy of the Nightbringer and found worthy of continuation. The plague god tended his reduced domain with a careful hand, understanding that his cycles of death and rebirth were privileges rather than rights. Even Slanesh, most selfish of the Chaos powers, had emerged from the conflict with a newfound appreciation for the concept of limitation. The Prince of Excess maintained a single palace of mirrors, each reflection carefully crafted to show not infinite desire, but the beauty that came from accepting boundaries as necessary components of meaning. The renegade god Malice had not survived the convergence in any recognizable form. The nihilistic entity had finally achieved its ultimate goal of complete self-negation, becoming a void in the warp, where the concept of meaninglessness had consumed even itself. The absence left by its dissolution served as a reminder of what awaited any force that pushed the principle of contradiction beyond the boundaries of existence. In the deep space between galaxies, where the outsider had returned to its prison of impossible angles, new wardings were being woven by intelligences that had learned to work together despite their fundamental incompatibilities. The Citan's madness had been contained, but not cured. Instead, it had been channeled into patterns that would serve as warnings to future generations about the dangers of consuming contradictions without purpose. The enslavers had been forced back into the spaces between dimensions, their attempted possession of the Emperor having failed when they discovered that his consciousness was not singular, but collective. The entities that had destroyed the old ones were now themselves prisoners, bound by chains forged from the combined will of every species that had achieved awareness since their first defeat. The old ones' echoes had returned to their rest in the deepest chambers of the webway, but not before leaving behind a legacy that would reshape the galaxy's understanding of its own nature. The psychic imprints of the galaxy's first intelligence had embedded new knowledge into the collective consciousness of their descendants, wisdom that spoke of cycles and repetitions that extended beyond the current age. On Terra, in the ruins of the Imperial Palace, where ancient technologies lay exposed by the cosmic battle, archivists were discovering records that predated human civilization by millions of years. These documents, written in languages that required psychic interpretation rather than linguistic analysis, told of previous convergences, earlier times when the galaxy's ancient prisoners had broken free and been contained again through the sacrifice of entire civilizations. Brother Librarian Tugurius of the Ultramarines, his psychic abilities enhanced beyond recognition by exposure to the cosmic forces during the battle, read these records with growing understanding and horror. The pattern was clear. Every 60 million years, give or take a few million, the seals would weaken and the ancient entities would stir. Each time, the current dominant species would be forced to prove their worthiness to continue existing by demonstrating their ability to contain forces that predated their evolution. This has happened before, he reported to his chapter master, through psychic channels that now reached across the entire galaxy, without need for warp translation. The records speak of at least 7 previous cycles. Each time, a different species served as the primary wardens of the ancient powers. Each time, they paid the same price we have just paid. Transformation into something beyond their original nature in service of a burden that must be carried for the sake of all consciousness. The revelation reached every surviving leader in the galaxy simultaneously, a truth that was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Humanity was not unique in facing this trial, nor were they alone in bearing the responsibility that came with success. They were part of an ancient succession of species that had earned the right to guide galactic evolution through their willingness to sacrifice individual desires for collective survival. Yet the knowledge came with an understanding that was perhaps more disturbing than ignorance had been. The cycle would continue. In 60 million years, perhaps less if the galaxy's evolution accelerated as it seemed to be doing, the seals would weaken again. A new test would come, and the species that dominated the galaxy at that time would face the same choice that humanity and its allies had just confronted. The imperium that emerged from the cosmic convergence was fundamentally different from what had existed before. Scattered across regions of space where the laws of physics operated according to principles established during the war in heaven, imperial forces found themselves adapting to realities that their training had never prepared them for. Space Marine chapters discovered that their gene seed was continuing to evolve, incorporating adaptations that would allow them to function in environments where time flowed backward, or where the distinction between matter and energy had become negotiable. The Chaos forces that had fought alongside the Imperium during the final battle did not return to their previous hostility. The shared experience of facing extinction had created bonds that transcended the ideological differences that had driven 10,000 years of warfare. An understanding had been reached, not through negotiation, but through the mutual recognition that their conflict was a luxury that could only exist in a stable universe. The new seals that bound the ancient entities were works of art as much as they were practical containments, woven from the collaborative efforts of imperial tech priests, chaos sorcerers, Eldar farseers, and intelligences that had no names in any mortal language. These prisons were not hidden away in forgotten corners of the galaxy, but integrated into the fundamental structure of reality itself, maintained by the ongoing existence of every awakened consciousness. The galaxy had survived its greatest test, but survival had come at a price that would reshape every aspect of existence for eons to come. The age of ignorance was over, replaced by an age of terrible knowledge and eternal vigilance. The ancient cycle would continue, but at least now those who bore the burden understood what they carried and why it was necessary to carry it. The war of all wars had ended, not with victory or defeat, but with transformation, and the scars it left would serve as reminders of the price that consciousness paid for the privilege of existing in a universe where awareness itself was both gift and responsibility. The eternal vigil, in the aftermath of cosmic war, when the dust of shattered realities had settled and the scars left by impossible geometries had begun to calcify into permanent features of local space-time, a new order emerged from the ruins of what had been. The galaxy that survived the war of all wars was not the same universe that had spawned it, nor were the beings who inherited the responsibility of maintaining its stability recognizable as the species they had been before the ancient seals cracked and bled primordial darkness into the modern age. The transformation began on Terra, where the Golden Throne had been rebuilt, not as a prison for a broken god, but as the nerve center of a network that spanned every awakened consciousness in the galaxy. The Emperor who ascended to this new seat of power was not the same entity who had guided humanity for 40,000 years, but something that had emerged from the fusion of his sacrifice with the collective will of every species that had participated in the cosmic convergence. Captain General Valoris knelt before this new incarnation of divine authority, his enhanced senses struggling to process the nature of what the master of mankind had become. The figure on the transformed throne existed simultaneously across multiple dimensions, its consciousness distributed through the psychic network that bound every sentient being in the galaxy into a single, vast monitoring system. "Rise, my son," the new emperor spoke, his words carrying harmonics that touched not just human minds, but the thoughts of Eldar, orcs, and even the diminished consciousnesses of the chaos gods themselves. The old forms of obeisance are no longer sufficient for what we must accomplish. You serve not a single species or a single ideal, but the principle of consciousness itself as it struggles to maintain its existence against forces that regard awareness as an aberration to be corrected. The unprecedented cooperation that had emerged during the final battle was crystallizing into permanent institutions that would have been unthinkable before the convergence. In the ruins of Cadia, where Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade had begun its assault on the Imperium's defenses, joint task forces composed of Imperial Guard and Chaos Space Marines worked together to establish monitoring stations that could detect the earliest signs of seal degradation. Lord Commander Creed, his tactical genius enhanced by exposure to cosmic forces during the war, found himself coordinating defensive strategies with Chaos Lords who had spent 10,000 years as his mortal enemies. The shared experience of facing extinction had created bonds that transcended the ideological divisions that had once seemed absolute. "The enemy we watch for makes our previous conflicts seem like disagreements between siblings," he explained to newly arrived reinforcements who struggled to understand why traitors and loyalists now worked in harmony. When you have seen entities that regard both order and disorder as equally meaningless deviations from cosmic truth, the differences between chaos and imperial doctrine become matters of tactical preference rather than fundamental incompatibility. Across the galaxy, new academies were being established to train the Watchers, individuals from every species who possessed the psychic sensitivity necessary to monitor the health of the ancient seals. These institutions brought together Imperial Psychers and Chaos Sorcerers, Eldar Farseers and Orc Weird Boys, all learning techniques that had been developed during the War of All Wars for detecting the subtle distortions that preceded cosmic intervention. For the first time since the War in Heaven, the galaxy's inhabitants understood the true nature of the universe they inhabited. They learned that the Chaos Gods, for all their malevolence, were recent arrivals compared to the entities that had been sealed away. They discovered that the great conflicts that had defined galactic history were merely surface phenomena, distractions from the deeper cosmic cycles that governed existence itself. Yet perhaps the most shocking revelation was the understanding that the Emperor had known this day would come since the very beginning of the Great Crusade. In the deepest vaults of the Imperial Palace, records were uncovered that showed his preparations had begun not with the Horus heresy, but with humanity's first steps into the galaxy 30,000 years ago. The Master of Mankind had encountered fragments of the ancient knowledge during his early explorations, discovering references to the cyclical tests that consciousness faced every 60 million years. Every decision he had made since then, from the creation of the Primarchs to the establishment of the Imperium itself, had been part of a vast preparation for the moment when humanity would be called upon to serve as the galaxy's primary wardens. I have watched species rise and fall across eons of galactic history, The new emperor revealed to the assembled representatives of every major faction. Each time the cycle begins anew, I have taken different forms, played different roles, always working toward the same goal: the preparation of consciousness itself for the trials that define its right to continue existing. The revelation reached every mind in the galaxy simultaneously, carried through the psychic network that now bound all awakened beings together. The Emperor was not merely an ancient human who had achieved divinity, but something far older and more fundamental, a recurring principle of cosmic evolution that manifested differently in each age, but always served the same essential function. The implications were staggering. Every species that had achieved galactic dominance had been guided by some manifestation of this principle, each iteration building upon the lessons learned from previous cycles. The current age was not the beginning of a new chapter in galactic history, but the latest verse in an epic that had been playing out since consciousness first emerged from primordial matter. In the Eye of Terror, where the remnants of the Chaos Gods maintained their diminished realms, new structures were being built that served purposes unimaginable during the previous age. Khorne's brass citadel was being converted into a training ground where the principles of necessary conflict could be studied and refined. Tzinch's crystal labyrinth had become a research facility dedicated to understanding the mathematics of change without falling into the nihilistic trap of change for its own sake. Nurgle's garden served as a laboratory where the cycles of death and renewal were carefully monitored to ensure they supported, rather than undermined, the stability of consciousness. Even Slanesh's Palace of Mirrors had been transformed, its chambers now used to explore the boundaries of experience that could be safely pursued without risking the kind of excess that had led to the galaxy's previous catastrophes. The renegade god Malice had left behind more than mere absence. The void where it had achieved perfect self-negation served as a constant reminder of what awaited any force that pursued contradiction beyond the boundaries of meaningful existence. Scholars from every species studied that emptiness, learning to recognize the signs that preceded the kind of nihilistic corruption that could unravel entire civilizations. In the spaces between galaxies, where the most dangerous entities remained in their new prisons, monitoring stations crewed by mixed-species teams maintained constant vigil. These outposts represented the farthest extent of galactic civilization, beacons of consciousness in regions where the fundamental laws of reality operated according to principles that had been established during earlier cosmic cycles. The beings who served in these positions underwent transformations that went beyond mere physical adaptation. They became living extensions of the monitoring network. Their consciousness expanded to perceive dimensions that baseline awareness could not process. They watched for the subtle signs that would indicate seal degradation, the slight changes in local space-time curvature that preceded reality distortions, the quantum fluctuations that suggested ancient intelligences were beginning to stir in their enforced slumber. The new civilization that emerged from the cosmic convergence was unlike anything that had existed in galactic history. It was not dominated by a single species or guided by a single ideology, but built around the shared understanding that consciousness itself was both gift and responsibility. Every awakened being, regardless of their origin or nature, contributed to the vast collaborative effort required to maintain the barriers that kept ultimate darkness at bay. Trade routes were established not just for the exchange of goods and resources, but for the circulation of knowledge about cosmic threats and monitoring techniques. Diplomatic protocols were developed that allowed species with fundamentally incompatible biologies and psychologies to work together toward common goals, Military alliances were forged between forces that had been mortal enemies for millennia, unified by the recognition that their survival depended on successful cooperation. The imperium that emerged from this transformation retained its essential character, but expanded its mission beyond the protection of humanity to encompass the defense of consciousness itself. Space Marine chapters found their recruitment pools expanded to include worthy candidates from every species, their gene seed adapted to work with biologies that the Emperor's original design had never anticipated. The Chaos forces that had fought alongside Imperial troops during the final battle did not abandon their patron gods, but learned to serve them in ways that supported, rather than undermined, cosmic stability. They became the galaxy's specialists in controlled corruption, experts in channeling chaotic energies for constructive purposes, while maintaining the vigilance necessary to prevent those energies from spiraling into destructive excess. As the New Age stabilized and the immediate crisis passed, a sobering truth became clear to all who participated in the great work of cosmic maintenance. The entities they had contained were not evil in any conventional sense, but represented necessary principles of existence that had become corrupted by isolation and misunderstanding. The goal was not to destroy these forces, but to integrate them into the larger pattern of cosmic evolution in ways that supported, rather than threatened, the continued development of consciousness. The war that had begun with the cracking of ancient seals was ending, not with victory or defeat, but with the establishment of a new equilibrium. The galaxy had learned to contain its darkest secrets, not by hiding from them, but by accepting responsibility for their management. Consciousness had proven its worthiness to continue existing by demonstrating its capacity for growth, cooperation, and sacrifice in service of principles larger than any individual species or civilization. Yet even as this new order took shape, those who understood its true nature remained aware that their achievement was temporary. In 60 million years, perhaps less, if cosmic evolution continued to accelerate, the seals would weaken again. A new test would come, and the species that dominated the galaxy at that time would face the same choice that had just been resolved. The eternal vigil had begun, and it would continue until consciousness itself evolved beyond the need for such tests or failed to meet the challenges they represented. The war against the true darkness had only just begun, and its outcome would determine not just the fate of the current galactic civilization, but the fundamental question of whether awareness itself deserved to persist in a universe that had no obligation to support its existence. In the end, the greatest revelation was that victory and defeat were meaningless concepts when applied to struggles that transcended individual lifespans and species lifetimes. There was only the eternal work of consciousness defending itself against forces that regarded its very existence as a temporary aberration in the cosmic order. Whether that defense would ultimately succeed or fail remained to be determined by generations not yet born, in ages not yet imagined. The galaxy turned in its ancient orbit, carrying its burden of awakened minds toward a future that would test them in ways they could not anticipate,